Welcome to this video. Today we're gonna read Fear and Trembling. I hope you enjoy.
Søren Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen in 1813, the youngest in a large, prosperous middle-class family, raised with the strictest devotion to church and religion. His father was a successful merchant, an avid reader of theology, while his mother was his father's servant before becoming his second wife. William Barrett, in Irrational Man, describes him as a bizarre and eccentric figure. He had fine eyes, but a spindly figure, a humped back, and a tousled head of hair made him look altogether rather like a scarecrow. The hunchback was perhaps the thorn in his flesh he often mentions in his writings. He accepted his ill-favored body with wry good humor, always able to see comedy and pathos together as one. A central focus of his thought is the relationship between faith and reason. One of the main themes of his writings is a reaction against Hegel and official state Christianity. Against Hegel, who had turned Christianity into something rational, Kierkegaard advocated a life of intense religious commitment. He leveled a profound critique of modernity and what Christianity had become in modernity. His thought questions what it means to be a Christian and aims to provide insight into the meaning and fulfillment of human life and to what makes a life worth living. The problem for Kierkegaard, as Barrett explains, was throughout a personal one. He had chosen to be a Christian and had constantly to renew that choice, with all the energy and passion of his being. All that he thought and wrote shows this personal cast. This is especially the case with Fear and Trembling. The subtitle appended to the text is a dialectical lyric, and Barrett sees this as an apt phrase for nearly all his writing. His thought was the lyric of Kierkegaard the man, frankly and avowedly an act of self-expression. Kierkegaard's writings present a number of difficulties. One is that many of his works are presented under a variety of pseudonyms. His principal pseudonymous author, Johannes Climacus, declared that his task was to make difficulties everywhere. In commenting on one work, Climacus states, "Thus it is left to the reader to put it all together by himself, if he so pleases, but nothing is done for a reader's comfort." Fear and Trembling, not merely in the realm of commerce, but in the world of ideas as well, our age is organizing a regular clearance sale. Everything is to be had at such a bargain that it is questionable whether in the end there is anybody who will want to bid. Every speculative price fixer who conscientiously directs attention to the significant march of modern philosophy, every private docent, tutor and student, every crofter and cotter in philosophy is not content with doubting everything but goes further. Perhaps it would be untimely and ill-timed to ask them where they are going, but surely it is courteous and unobtrusive to regard it as certain that they have doubted everything, since otherwise it would be a queer thing for them to be going further. This preliminary movement they have therefore all of them made, and presumably with such ease that they do not find it necessary to let drop a word about the how, for not even he who anxiously and with deep concern sought a little enlightenment was able to find any such thing, any guiding side, any little dietetic prescription, as to how one was to comport oneself in supporting this prodigious task. But Descartes did it. Descartes, a venerable, humble and honest thinker, whose writings surely no one can read without the deepest emotion, did what he said and said what he did. Alas, alack, that is a great rarity in our times. Descartes, as he repeatedly affirmed, did not doubt in matters of faith. He did not cry fire, nor did he make it a duty for everyone to doubt, for Descartes was a quiet and solitary thinker, not a bellowing night watchman. He modestly admitted that his method had importance for him alone, and was justified in part by the bundled knowledge of his earlier years, what those ancient Greeks regarded as a task for a whole lifetime, seeing that dexterity in doubting is not acquired in a few days or weeks, what the veteran combatant attained when he had preserved the equilibrium of doubt through all the pitfalls he encountered, who intrepidly denied the certainty of sense perception and the certainty of the processes of thought, incorruptibly defied the apprehensions of self-love and the insinuations of sympathy. That is where everybody begins in our time. In our time, nobody is content to stop with faith, but wants to go further. It would perhaps be rash to ask where these people are going, but it is surely a sign of breeding and culture for me to assume that everybody has faith, for otherwise it would be queer for them to be going further. In those old days it was different. Then faith was a task for a whole lifetime, because it was assumed that dexterity in faith is not acquired in a few days or weeks. When the tried ulcer drew near to his last hour, having fought the good fight and kept the faith, his heart was still young enough not to have forgotten that fear and trembling which chastened the youth, which the man indeed held in check, but which no man quite outgrows except as he, might succeed at the earliest opportunity in going further. Where these revered figures arrive, that is the point where everybody in our day begins to go further. The present writer is nothing of a philosopher. He has not understood the system, does not know whether it actually exists, whether it is completed. Already he has enough for his weak head in the thought of what a prodigious head everybody in our day must have, since everybody has such a prodigious thought. Even though one were capable of converting the whole content of faith into the form of a concept, it does not follow that one has adequately conceived faith and understands how one got into it, or how it got into one. The present writer is nothing of a philosopher. He is, poetis et eleganter, an amateur writer who neither writes the system nor promises of the system, who neither subscribes to the system nor ascribes anything to it. He writes because for him it is a luxury which becomes the more agreeable and more evident, the fewer there are who buy and read what he writes. He can easily foresee his fate in an age when passion has been obliterated in favor of learning, in an age when an author who wants to have readers must take care to write in such a way that the book can easily be perused during the afternoon nap, and take care to fashion his outward deportment in likeness to the picture of that polite young gardener in the advertisement sheet, who with hat in hand, and with a good certificate from the place where he last served, recommends himself to the esteemed public. He foresees his fate, that he will be entirely ignored. He has a presentiment of the dreadful event, that a jealous criticism will many a time let him feel the verge. He trembles at the still more dreadful thought that one or another enterprising scribe, a gulper of paragraphs, who to rescue learning is always willing to do with other people's writings what Trop to Sate appearances magnanimously resolved to do with a book called The Destruction of the Human Race. That is, he will slice the author into paragraphs, and will do it with the same inflexibility as the man who in the interest of the science of punctuation divided his discourse by counting the words, so that there were 50 words for a period and 35 for a semicolon. I prostrate myself with the profoundest deference before every systematic back peer at the custom house, protesting, this is not the system, it has nothing whatever to do with the system. I call down every blessing upon the system, and upon the Danish shareholders in this omnibus, for a tower it is hardly likely to become. I wish them all and sundry good luck and all prosperity. Respectfully, Johannes de Silentio, a panegyric upon Abraham. If there were no eternal consciousness in a man, if at the foundation of all there lay only a wildly seething power which writhing with obscure passions produced everything that is great and everything that is insignificant, if a bottomless void never satiated lay hidden beneath all, what then would life be but despair? If such were the case, if there were no sacred bond which united mankind, if one generation arose after another like the leafage in the forest, if the one generation replaced the other like the song of birds in the forest, if the human race passed through the world as the ship goes through the sea, like the wind through the desert, a thoughtless and fruitless activity, if an eternal oblivion were always lurking hungrily for its prey, and there was no power strong enough to wrest it from its maw, how empty then and comfortless life would be. But therefore it is not thus, but as God created man and woman, so too he fashioned the hero and the poet or orator. The poet cannot do what that other does, he can only admire, love and rejoice in the hero. Yet he too is happy, and not less so, for the hero is as it were his better nature, with which he is in love, rejoicing in the fact that this after all is not himself, that his love can be admiration. He is the genius of recollection, can do nothing except call to mind what has been done, do nothing but admire what has been done. He contributes nothing of his own, but is jealous of the entrusted treasure. Life follows the option of his heart, but when he has found what he sought, he wanders before every man's door with his song and with his oration, that all may admire the hero as he does, be proud of the hero as he is. This is his achievement, his humble work, this is his faithful service in the house of the hero. If he thus remains true to his love, he strives day and night against the cunning of oblivion which would trick him out of his hero. Then he has completed his work, then he is gathered to the hero, who has loved him just as faithfully, for the poet is as it were the hero's better nature, powerless it may be as a memory is, but also transfigured as a memory is. Hence no one shall be forgotten who was great, and though time tarries long, though a cloud of misunderstanding takes the hero away, his lover comes nevertheless, and the longer the time that has passed, the more faithfully will he cling to him. No, not one shall be forgotten who was great in the world, but each was great in his own way, and each in proportion to the greatness of that which he loved. For he who loved himself became great by himself, and he who loved other men became great by his selfless devotion. But he who loved God became greater than all. Everyone shall be remembered, but each became great in proportion to his expectation. One became great by expecting the possible, another by expecting the eternal, but he who expected the impossible became greater than all. Everyone shall be remembered, but each was great in proportion to the greatness of that with which he strove. For he who strove with the world became great by overcoming the world, and he who strove with himself became great by overcoming himself. But he who strove with God became greater than all. So there was strife in the world, man against man, one against 1,000. but he who strove with God was greater than all. So there was strife upon earth, there was one who overcame all by his power, and there was one who overcame God by his impotence. There was one who relied upon himself and gained all, there was one who secured in his strength sacrificed all, but he who believed God was greater than all. There was one who was great by reason of his power, and one who was great by reason of his wisdom, and one who was great by reason of his hope, and one who was great by reason of his love. But Abraham was greater than all, great by reason of his power whose strength is impotence, great by reason of his wisdom whose secret is foolishness, great by reason of his hope whose form is madness, great by reason of the love which is hatred of oneself. By faith Abraham went out from the land of his fathers and became a sojourner in the land of promise. He left one thing behind, took one thing with him. He left his earthly understanding behind and took faith with him. Otherwise he would not have wandered forth but would have thought this unreasonable. By faith he was a stranger in the land of promise, and there was nothing to recall what was dear to him. But by its novelty everything tempted his soul to melancholy yearning, and yet he was God's elect, in whom the Lord was well pleased. Yea, if he had been disowned, cast off from God's grace, he could have comprehended it better, but now it was like a mockery of him and of his faith. There was in the world one too who lived in banishment from the fatherland he loved. He is not forgotten, nor his lamentations when he sorrowfully sought and found what he had lost. There is no song of lamentations by Abraham. It is human to lament, human to weep with them that weep. But it is greater to believe, more blessed to contemplate the believer. By faith Abraham received the promise that in his seed all races of the world would be blessed. Time passed, the possibility was there, Abraham believed. Time passed, it became unreasonable. Abraham believed. There was in the world one who had an expectation. Time passed, the evening drew nigh, he was not paltry enough to have forgotten his expectation. Therefore he too shall not be forgotten. Then he sorrowed, and sorrow did not deceive him as life had done, it did for him all it could. In the sweetness of sorrow he possessed his delusive expectation. It is human to sorrow with them that sorrow, but it is greater to believe, more blessed to contemplate the believer. There is no song of lamentations by Abraham. He did not mournfully count the days while time passed. He did not look at Sarah with a suspicious glance, wondering whether she were growing old. He did not arrest the course of the sun, that Sarah might not grow old, and his expectation with her. He did not sing lullingly before Sarah his mournful lay. Abraham became old, Sarah became a laughing stock in the land, and yet he was God's elect and inheritor of the promise that in his seed all the races of the world would be blessed. So were it not better if he had not been God's elect? What is it to be God's elect? It is to be denied in youth the wishes of youth, so as with great pains to get them fulfilled in old age. But Abraham believed and held fast the expectation. If Abraham had wavered, he would have given it up. If he had said to God, then perhaps it is not after all thy will that it should come to pass, so I will give up the wish. It was my only wish, it was my bliss. My soul is sincere, I hide no secret malice because thou didst deny it to me. He would not have been forgotten. He would have saved many by his example, yet he would not be the father of faith. For it is great to give up one's wish, but it is greater to hold it fast after having given it up. It is great to grasp the eternal, but it is greater to hold fast to the temporal after having given it up. Then came the fullness of time. If Abraham had not believed, Sarah surely would have been dead of sorrow, and Abraham, dulled by grief, would not have understood the fulfillment but would have smiled at it as at a dream of youth. But Abraham believed, therefore he was young, for he who always hopes for the best becomes old, and he who is always prepared for the worst grows old early, but he who believes preserves an eternal youth. Praise therefore to that story. For Sarah, though stricken in years, was young enough to desire the pleasure of motherhood, and Abraham, though gray-haired, was young enough to wish to be a father. In an outward respect, the marvel consists in the fact that it came to pass according to their expectation. In a deeper sense, the miracle of faith consists in the fact that Abraham and Sarah were young enough to wish, and that faith had preserved their wish and therewith their youth. He accepted the fulfillment of the promise. He accepted it by faith, and it came to pass according to the promise and according to his faith. For Moses smote the rock with his rod, but he did not believe. Then there was joy in Abraham's house when Sarah became a bride on the day of their golden wedding. But it was not to remain thus. Still once more Abraham was to be tried. He had fought with that cunning power which invents everything, with that alert enemy which never slumbers, with that old man who outlives all things. He had fought with time and preserved his faith. Now all the terror of the strife was concentrated in one instant. And God tempted Abraham and said unto him, Take Isaac, thy only son, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon the mountain which I will show thee. So all was lost, more dreadfully than if it had never come to pass, so the Lord was only making sport of Abraham. He made miraculously the preposterous actual, and now in turn he would annihilate it. It was, indeed, foolishness, but Abraham did not laugh at it like Sarah when the promise was announced. All was lost. 70 years of faithful expectation, the brief joy at the fulfillment of faith. Who then is he that plucks away the old man's staff? Who is it that requires that he himself shall break it? Who is he that would make a man's gray hairs comfortless? Who is it that requires that he himself shall do it? Is there no compassion for the venerable oldling, none for the innocent child? And yet Abraham was God's elect, and it was the Lord who imposed the trial. All would now be lost. The glorious memory to be preserved by the human race, the promise in Abraham's seed, this was only a whim, a fleeting thought which the Lord had had, which Abraham should now obliterate. That glorious treasure which was just as old as faith in Abraham's heart, many, many years older than Isaac, the fruit of Abraham's life, sanctified by prayers, matured in conflict, the blessing upon Abraham's lips, this fruit was now to be plucked prematurely and remain without significance. For what significance had it when Isaac was to be sacrificed? That sad and yet blissful hour when Abraham was to take leave of all that was dear to him, when yet once more he was to lift up his head, when his countenance would shine like that of the Lord, when he would concentrate his whole soul in a blessing which was potent to make Isaac blessed all his days. This time would not come, for he would indeed take leave of Isaac, but in such a way that he himself would remain behind. Death would separate them, but in such a way that Isaac remained its prey. The old man would not be joyful in death as he laid his hands in blessing upon Isaac, but he would be weary of life as he laid violent hands upon Isaac. And it was God who tried him. Yea, woe unto the messenger who had come before Abraham with such tidings, who would have ventured to be the emissary of this sorrow. But it was God who tried Abraham. Yet Abraham believed, and believed for this life. Yea, if his faith had been only for a future life, he surely would have cast everything away in order to hasten out of this world to which he did not belong. But Abraham's faith was not of this sort, if there be such a faith, for really this is not faith but the furthest possibility of faith which has a presentiment of its object at the extremest limit of the horizon, yet is separated from it by a yawning abyss within which despair carries on its gain. But Abraham believed precisely for this life, that he was to grow old in the land, honored by the people, blessed in his generation, remembered forever in Isaac, his dearest thing in life, whom he embraced with a love for which it would be a poor expression to say that he loyally fulfilled the father's duty of loving the son, as indeed is evinced in the words of the summons, "The son whom thou lovest." Jacob had 12 sons, and one of them he loved. Abraham had only one, the son whom he loved. Yet Abraham believed and did not doubt. He believed the preposterous. If Abraham had doubted, then he would have done something else, something glorious, for how could Abraham do anything but what is great and glorious? He would have marched up to Mount Moriah. He would have cleft the firewood, lit the pyre, drawn the knife. He would have cried out to God, "Despise not this sacrifice. It is not the best thing I possess, that I know well, for what is an old man in comparison with the child of promise? But it is the best I am able to give thee. Let Isaac never come to know this, that he may console himself with his youth." He would have plunged the knife into his own breast. He would have been admired in the world, and his name would not have been forgotten. But it is one thing to be admired, and another to be the guiding star which saves the anguished. But Abraham believed. He did not pray for himself, with the hope of moving the Lord. It was only when the righteous punishment was decreed upon Sodom and Gomorrah that Abraham came forward with his prayers. We read in those holy books, "And God tempted Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, Abraham, where art thou? And he said, Here am I thou to whom my speech is addressed. Was such the case with thee? When afar off thou didst see the heavy dispensation of providence approaching thee, didst thou not say to the mountains, Fall on me, and to the hills, Cover me? Or if thou wast stronger, did not thy foot move slowly along the way, longing as it were for the old path? When a call was issued to thee, didst thou answer, or didst thou not answer perhaps in a low voice, whisperingly? Not so Abraham, joyfully, buoyantly, confidently, with a loud voice, he answered, Here am I. We read further, and Abraham rose early in the morning, as though it were to a festival, so he hastened. And early in the morning he had come to the place spoken of, to Mount Moriah. He said nothing to Sarah, nothing to Eleazar. Indeed, who could understand him? Had not the temptation by its very nature exacted of him an oath of silence? He cleft the wood, he bound Isaac. He lit the pyre, he drew the knife. My hearer, there was many a father who believed that with his son he lost everything that was dearest to him in the world, that he was deprived of every hope for the future, but yet there was none that was the child of promise in the sense that Isaac was for Abraham. There was many a father who lost his child, but then it was God, it was the unalterable, the unsearchable will of the Almighty, it was his hand took the child. Not so with Abraham. For him was reserved a harder trial, and Isaac's fate was laid along with the knife in Abraham's hand. And there he stood, the old man, with his only hope. But he did not doubt, he did not look anxiously to the right or to the left, he did not challenge heaven with his prayers. He knew that it was God the Almighty who was trying him, he knew that it was the hardest sacrifice that could be required of him. But he knew also that no sacrifice was too hard when God required it, and he drew the knife. Who gave strength to Abraham's arm? Who held his right hand up so that it did not fall limp at his side? He who gazes at this becomes paralyzed. Who gave strength to Abraham's soul so that his eyes did not grow dim, so that he saw neither Isaac nor the ram? He who gazes at this becomes blind. And yet rare enough perhaps is the man who becomes paralyzed and blind, still more rare one who worthily recounts what happened. We all know it was only a trial. If Abraham when he stood upon Mount Moriah had doubted, if he had gazed about him irresolutely, if when he drew the knife he had by chance discovered the ram, if God had permitted him to offer it instead of Isaac, then he would have taken himself home, everything would have been the same, he has Sarah, he retained Isaac, and yet how changed. For his retreat would have been a flight, his salvation an accident, his reward dishonor, his future perhaps perdition. Then he would have borne witness neither to his faith nor to God's grace, but would have testified only how dreadful it is to march out to Mount Moriah. Then Abraham would not have been forgotten, nor would Mount Moriah, this mountain would then be mentioned, not like Ararat where the ark landed, but would be spoken of as a consternation, because it was here that Abraham doubted. Venerable Father Abraham, in marching home from Mount Moriah thou hadst no need of a panegyric which might console thee for thy loss, for thou didst gain all and didst retain Isaac. Was it not so? Never again did the Lord take him from thee, but thou didst sit at table joyfully with him in thy tent, as thou dost in the beyond to all eternity. Venerable Father Abraham, thousands of years have run their course since those days, but thou hast need of no tardy lover to snatch the memorial of thee from the power of oblivion, for every land which calls thee to remembrance. And yet thou dost reward thy lover more gloriously than does any other, hereafter thou dost make him blessed in thy bosom, here thou dost enthrall his eyes and his heart by the marvel of thy deed. Venerable Father Abraham, thou who first wast sensible of and didst first bear witness to that prodigious passion which disdains the dreadful conflict with the rage of the elements, and with the powers of creation in order to strive with God, thou who first didst know that highest passion, the holy, pure and humble expression of the divine madness which the pagans admire, forgive him who would speak in praise of thee if he does not do it fittingly. He spoke humbly as if it were the desire of his own heart, he spoke briefly as it becomes him to do. But he will never forget that thou hadst need of 100 years to obtain a son of old age against expectation, that thou didst have to draw the knife before retaining Isaac. He will never forget that in 130 years thou didst not get further than to faith. Problemata, preliminary expectoration. An old proverb fetched from the outward aspect of the visible world says, only the man that works gets the bread. Strangely enough, this proverb does not aptly apply in that world to which it expressly belongs, for the outward world is subjected to the law of imperfection, and again the experience is repeated that he too who does not work gets the bread, and that he who sleeps gets it more abundantly than the man who works. In the outward world everything is made payable to the bearer. This world is in bondage to the law of indifference, and to him who has the ring. The spirit of the ring is obedient, whether he be Nerdin or Aladdin, and he who has the world's treasure has it, however he got it. It is different in the world of spirit. Here an eternal divine order prevails. Here it does not rain both upon the just and upon the unjust. Here the sun does not shine both upon the good and upon the evil. Here it holds good that only he who works gets the bread, only he who was in anguish finds repose, only he who descends into the underworld rescues the beloved, only he who draws the knife gets Isaac. He who will not work does not get the bread but remains deluded, as the gods deluded Orpheus with an airy figure in place of the loved one, deluded him because he was effeminate, not courageous, because he was a cithara player, not a man. Here it is of no use to have Abraham for one's father, nor to have 17 ancestors. He who will not work must take note of what is written about the maidens of Israel, for he gives birth to wine. But he who is willing to work gives birth to his own father. There is a knowledge which would presumptuously introduce into the world of spirit the same law of indifference under which the external world sighs. It counts it enough to think the great, other work is not necessary, but therefore it doesn't get the bread, it perishes of hunger while everything is transformed into gold. And what does it really know? There were many thousands of Greek contemporaries, and countless numbers in subsequent generations, who knew all the triumphs of Miltiades, but only one was made sleepless by them. There were countless generations which knew by rote, word for word, the story of Abraham, how many were made sleepless by it. Now the story of Abraham has the remarkable property that it is always glorious. However poorly one may understand it, yet here again the proverb applies, that all depends upon whether one is willing to labor and be heavy laden. But they will not labor, and yet they would understand the story. They exalt Abraham. But how? They express the whole thing in perfectly general terms. The great thing was that he loved God so much that he was willing to sacrifice to him the best. That is very true, but the best is an indefinite expression. In the course of thought, as the tongue wags on, Isaac and the best are confidently identified. An ego meditates can very well smoke his pipe during the meditation, and the auditor can very well stretch out his legs in comfort. In case that rich young man whom Christ encountered on the road had sold all his goods and given to the poor, we should extol him, as we do all that is great. No, without labor we would not understand him, and yet he would not have become an Abraham in spite of the fact that he offered his best. What they leave out of Abraham's history is dread, for to money I have no ethical obligation, but to the son the father has the highest and most sacred obligation. Dread, however, is a perilous thing for effeminate natures, hence they forget it, and in spite of that they want to talk about Abraham. So they talk. In the course of the oration they use indifferently the two terms, Isaac and the best. Aldous famously. However, if it chanced that among the auditors there was one who suffered from insomnia, then the most dreadful, the profoundest tragic and comic misunderstanding lies very close. He went home, he would do as Abraham did, for the son is indeed the best. If the orator got to know of it, he perhaps went to him, he summoned all his clerical dignity, he shouted, "O abominable man, offscouring of society, what devil possessed thee to want to murder thy son?" And the parson, who had not been conscious of warmth or perspiration in preaching about Abraham, is astonished at himself, at the earnest wrath which he thundered down upon that poor man. He was delighted with himself, for he had never spoken with such verve and unction. He said to himself and to his wife, "I am an orator. What I lacked was the occasion. When I talk about Abraham on Sunday, I did not feel moved in the least. In case the same orator had a little superabundance of reason which might be lost, I think he would have lost it if the sitter were to say calmly and with dignity, that in fact is what you yourself preached on Sunday." How could the parson be able to get into his head such a consequence? And yet it was so, and the mistake was merely that he didn't know what he was saying. Would there were a poet who might resolve to prefer such situations, rather than the stuff and nonsense with which comedies and novels are filled. The comic and the tragic here touch one another at the absolute point of infinity. The parson's speech was perhaps in itself ludicrous enough, but it became infinitely ludicrous by its effect, and yet this consequence was quite natural. Or if the sinner, without raising any objection, were to be converted by the parson's severe lecture, if the zealous clergyman were to go joyfully home, rejoicing in the consciousness that he not only was effective in the pulpit, but above all by his irresistible power as a pastor of souls, who on Sunday roused the congregation to enthusiasm, and on Monday like a cherub with a flaming sword placed himself before the man who by his action wanted to put to shame the old proverb, that things don't go on in the world as the parson preaches. If on the other hand the sinner was not convinced, his situation is pretty tragic. Presumably he would be executed or sent to the lunatic asylum. In short, he would have become unhappy in relation to so-called reality. In another sense, I can well think that Abraham made him happy, for he that labors does not perish. How is one to explain the contradiction illustrated by that orator? Is it because Abraham had a prescriptive right to be a great man, so that what he did is great, and when another does the same it is sin, a heinous sin? In that case, I do not wish to participate in such thoughtless eulogy. If faith does not make it a holy act to be willing to murder one's son, then let the same condemnation be pronounced upon Abraham as upon every other man. If a man perhaps lacks courage to carry his thought through and to say that Abraham was a murderer, then it is surely better to acquire this courage rather than waste time upon undeserved eulogies. The ethical expression for what Abraham did is that he would murder Isaac. The religious expression is that he would sacrifice Isaac. But precisely in this contradiction consists the dread which can well make a man sleepless, and yet Abraham is not what he is without this dread. Or perhaps he did not do at all what is related, but something altogether different, which is accounted for by the circumstances of his times. Then let us forget him, for it is not worthwhile to remember that past which cannot become a present. Or had perhaps that orator forgotten something which corresponds to the ethical forgetfulness of the fact that Isaac was the son? For when faith is eliminated by becoming null or nothing, then there only remains the crude fact that Abraham wanted to murder Isaac, which is easy enough for anyone to imitate who has not faith, the faith, that is to say, which makes it hard for him. For my part, I do not lack the courage to think a thought whole. Hitherto there has been no thought I have been afraid of. If I should run across such a thought, I hope that I have at least the sincerity to say, I am afraid of this thought, it stirs up something else in me, and therefore I will not think it. If in this I do wrong, the punishment will not fail to follow. If I had recognized that it was the verdict of truth that Abraham was a murderer, I do not know whether I would have been able to silence my pious veneration for him. However, if I had thought that, I presumably would have kept silent about it, for one should not initiate others into such thoughts. But Abraham is no dazzling illusion. He did not slip into renown, it was not a whim of fate. Can one then speak plainly about Abraham without incurring the danger that an individual might in bewilderment go ahead and do likewise? If I do not dare to speak freely, I will be completely silent about Abraham. Above all, I will not disparage him in such a way that precisely thereby he becomes a pitfall for the weak. For if one makes faith everything, that is, makes it what it is, then, according to my way of thinking, one may speak of it without danger in our age, which hardly extravagates in the matter of faith, and it is only by faith one attains likeness to Abraham, not by murder. If one makes love a transitory mood, a voluptuous emotion in a man, then one only lays pitfalls for the weak when one would talk about the exploits of love. Transient emotions every man surely has, but if as a consequence of such emotions one would do the terrible thing which love has sanctified as an immortal exploit, then all is lost, including the exploit and the bewildered doer of it. So one surely can talk about Abraham, for the great can never do harm when it is apprehended in its greatness. It is like a two-edged sword which slays and saves. If it should fall to my lot to talk on this subject, I would begin by showing what a pious and God-fearing man Abraham was, worthy to be called God's elect. Only upon such a man is imposed such a test. But where is there such a man? Next I would describe how Abraham loved Isaac. To this end I would pray all good spirits to come to my aid, that my speech might be as flowing as paternal love is. I hope that I should be able to describe it in such a way that there would not be many a father in the realms and territories of the king who would dare to affirm that he loved his son in such a way. But if he does not love like Abraham, then every thought of offering Isaac would be not a trial but a base temptation. On this theme one could talk for several Sundays. One need be in no haste. The consequence would be that, if one spoke rightly, some few of the fathers would not require to hear more, but for the time being they would be joyful if they really succeeded in loving their sons as Abraham loved. If there was one who, after having heard about the greatness, but also about the dreadfulness of Abraham's deed, ventured to go forth upon that road, I would saddle my horse and ride with him. At every stopping place till we came to Mount Moriah, I would explain to him that he still could turn back, could repent the misunderstanding that he was called to be tried in such a conflict, that he could confess his lack of courage, so that God himself must take Isaac, if he would have him. It is my conviction that such a man is not repudiated, but may become blessed like all the others. But in time he does not become blessed. Would they not, even in the great ages of faith, have passed this judgment upon such a man? I knew a person who on one occasion could have saved my life if he had been magnanimous. He said, "I see well enough what I could do, but I do not dare to. I am afraid that later I might lack strength and that I should regret it." He was not magnanimous, but who for this cause would not continue to love him. Having spoken thus and moved the audience so that at least they had sensed the dialectical conflict of faith and its gigantic passion, I would not give rise to the error on the part of the audience that he then has faith in such a high degree that it is enough for us to hold on to his skirts. For I would add, I have no faith at all. I am by nature a shrewd pate, and every such person always has great difficulty in making the movements of faith. Not that I attach, however, in and for itself, any value to this difficulty which through the overcoming of it brought the clever head further than the point which the simplest and most ordinary man reaches more easily. After all, in the poets love has its priests, and sometimes one hears a voice which knows how to defend it, but of faith one hears never a word. Who speaks in honor of this passion? Philosophy goes further. Theology sits rouged at the window and courts its favor, offering to sell her charms to philosophy. It is supposed to be difficult to understand Hegel, but to understand Abraham is a trifle. To go beyond Hegel is a miracle, but to get beyond Abraham is the easiest thing of all. I for my part have devoted a good deal of time to the understanding of the Hegelian philosophy. I believe also that I understand it tolerably well, but when in spite of the trouble I have taken there are certain passages I cannot understand, I am foolhardy enough to think that he himself has not been quite clear. All this I do easily and naturally, my head does not suffer from it. But on the other hand, when I have to think of Abraham, I am as though annihilated. I catch sight every moment of that enormous paradox which is the substance of Abraham's life. Every moment I am repelled, and my thought in spite of all its passion cannot get a hair's breadth further. I strain every muscle to get a view of it. That very instant I am paralyzed. I am not unacquainted with what has been admired as great and noble in the world. My soul feels affinity with it, being convinced in all humility that it was in my cause the hero contended, and the instant I contemplate his deed I cry out to myself, Jam tuor res agitor. I think myself into the hero, but into Abraham I cannot think myself. When I reach the height I fall down, for what I encounter there is the paradox. I do not however mean in any sense to say that faith is something lowly, but on the contrary that it is the highest thing, and that it is dishonest of philosophy to give something else instead of it, and to make light of faith. Philosophy cannot and should not give faith, but it should understand itself and know what it has to offer and take nothing away. and least of all should fool people out of something as if it were nothing. I am not unacquainted with the perplexities and dangers of life. I do not fear them, and I encounter them buoyantly. I am not unacquainted with the dreadful. My memory is a faithful wife, and my imagination is a diligent little maiden who all day sits quietly at her work, and in the evening knows how to chat to me about it so prettily that I must look at it, though not always, I must say, is it landscapes, or flowers, or pastoral idols she paints. I have seen the dreadful before my own eyes. I do not flee from it timorously, but I know very well that, although I advance to meet it, my courage is not the courage of faith, nor anything comparable to it. I am unable to make the movements of faith. I cannot shut my eyes and plunge confidently into the absurd. For me that is an impossibility. But I do not boast of it. I am convinced that God is love. This thought has for me a primitive lyrical validity. When it is present to me, I am unspeakably blissful. When it is absent, I long for it more vehemently than does the lover for his object. But I do not believe. This courage I lack. For me the love of God is, both in a direct and in an inverse sense, incommensurable with the whole of reality. I am not cowardly enough to whimper and complain, but neither am I deceitful enough to deny that faith is something much higher. I can well endure living in my way. I am joyful and content, but my joy is not that of faith, and in comparison with that it is unhappy. I do not trouble God with my petty sorrows. The particular does not trouble me. I gaze only at my love, and I keep its virginal flame pure and clear. Faith is convinced that God is concerned about the least things. I am content in this life with being married to the left hand. Faith is humble enough to demand the right hand, for that this is humility I do not deny and shall never deny. But really is everyone in my generation capable of making the movements of faith? I wonder. Unless I am very much mistaken, this generation is rather inclined to be proud of making what they do not even believe I am capable of making, viz., incomplete movements. It is repugnant to me to do as so often is done, namely, to speak inhumanly about a great deed, as though some thousands of years were an immense distance. I would rather speak humanly about it, as though it had occurred yesterday, letting only the greatness be the distance, which either exalts or condemns. So if I had been summoned to undertake such a royal progress to Mount Moriah, I know well what I would have done. I would not have been cowardly enough to stay at home, neither would I have laid down or sauntered along the way, nor have forgotten the knife, so that there might be a little delay. I am pretty well convinced that I would have been there on the stroke of the clock, and would have had everything in order. Perhaps I would have arrived too early in order to get through with it sooner. But I also know what else I would have done. The very instant I mounted the horse I would have said to myself, now all is lost. God requires Isaac, I sacrifice him, and with him my joy, yet God is love and continues to be that for me. For in the temporal world God and I cannot talk together. We have no language in common. Perhaps one or another in our age will be foolish enough, or envious enough of the great, to want to make himself and me believe that if I really had done this, I would have done even a greater deed than Abraham, for my prodigious resignation was far more ideal and poetic than Abraham's narrow-mindedness. And yet this is the greatest falsehood, for my prodigious resignation was the surrogate for faith, nor could I do more than make the infinite movement, in order to find myself and again repose in myself. In that case I would not have loved Isaac as Abraham loved. That I was resolute in making the movement might prove my courage. Humanly speaking, that I loved him with all my soul is the presumption apart from which the whole thing becomes a crime. But yet I did not love like Abraham, for in that case I would have held back even at the last minute, though not for this would I have arrived too late at Mount Moriah. Besides, by my behavior I would have spoiled the whole story, for if I had got Isaac back again, I would have been in embarrassment. What Abraham found easiest, I would have found hard, namely to be joyful again with Isaac. For he who with all the infinity of his soul, propria modulet propria is auspiciis by his own power and on his own responsibility, has performed the infinite movement, and cannot do more, only retains Isaac with pain. But what did Abraham do? He arrived neither too soon nor too late. He mounted the ass, he rode slowly along the way. All that time he believed. He believed that God would not require Isaac of him, whereas he was willing nevertheless to sacrifice him if it was required. He believed by virtue of the absurd, for there could be no question of human calculation, and it was indeed the absurd that God who required it of him should the next instant recall the requirement. He climbed the mountain. Even at the instant when the knife glittered he believed that God would not require Isaac. He was indeed astonished at the outcome, but by a double movement he had reached his first position, and therefore he received Isaac more gladly than the first time. Let us go further. We let Isaac be really sacrificed. Abraham believed. He did not believe that someday he would be blessed in the beyond, but that he would be happy here in the world. God could give him a new Isaac, could recall to life him who had been sacrificed. He believed by virtue of the absurd, for all human reckoning had long since ceased to function. That sorrow can derange a man's mind, that we see, and it is sad enough. that there is such a thing as strength of will which is able to haul up so exceedingly close to the wind that it saves a man's reason, even though he remains a little queer, that too one sees. I have no intention of disparaging this, but to be able to lose one's reason, and therefore the whole of finiteness of which reason is the broker, and then by virtue of the absurd to gain precisely the same finiteness that appalls my soul. But I do not for this cause say that it is something lowly, since on the contrary it is the only prodigy. Generally, people are of the opinion that what faith produces is not a work of art, that it is coarse and common work, only for the more clumsy natures. But in fact, this is far from the truth. The dialectic of faith is the finest and most remarkable of all. It possesses an elevation, of which indeed I can form a conception, but nothing more. I am able to make from the springboard the great leap whereby I pass into infinity. My back is like that of a tightrope dancer, having been twisted in my childhood. Hence I find this easy, with a 1, 2, 3. I can walk about existence on my head, but the next thing I cannot do, for I cannot perform the miraculous, but can only be astonished by it. Yes, if Abraham the instant he swung his leg over the ass's back had said to himself, "Now, since Isaac is lost, I might just as well sacrifice him here at home, rather than ride the long way to Moriah, then I should have no need of Abraham, whereas now I bow 7 times before his name and 70 times before his deed." For this indeed he did not do, as I can prove by the fact that he was glad of receiving Isaac, heartily glad, that he needed no preparation, no time to concentrate upon the finite and its joy. If this had not been the case with Abraham, then perhaps he might have loved God but not believed. For he who loves God without faith reflects upon himself, he who loves God believingly reflects upon God. Upon this pinnacle stands Abraham. The last stage he loses sight of is the infinite resignation. He really goes further and reaches faith, for all these caricatures of faith, the miserable lukewarm indolence which thinks there surely is no instant need, it is not worthwhile sorrowing before the time, the pitiful hope which says, one cannot know what is going to happen. It might possibly be after all, these caricatures of faith are part and parcel of life's wretchedness, and the infinite resignation has already consigned them to infinite content. Abraham I cannot understand, in a certain sense there is nothing I can learn from him but astonishment. If people fancy that by considering the outcome of this story they might let themselves be moved to believe, they deceive themselves and want to swindle God out of the first movement of faith, the infinite resignation. They would suck worldly wisdom out of the paradox. Perhaps one or another may succeed in that, for our age is not willing to stop with faith. With its miracle of turning water into wine, it goes further, it turns wine into water. Would it not be better to stop with faith? And is it not revolting that everybody wants to go further? When in our age they will not stop with love, where then are they going? To earthly wisdom, to petty calculation, to paltriness and wretchedness, to everything which can make man's divine origin doubtful. Would it not be better that they should stand still at faith, and that he who stands should take heed lest he fall? For the movements of faith must constantly be made by virtue of the absurd, yet in such a way, be it absurd, that one does not lose the finite but gains it every inch. For my part I can well describe the movements of faith, but I cannot make them. When one would learn to make the motions of swimming, one can let oneself be hung by a swimming belt from the ceiling and go through the motions. But one is not swimming. In that way I can describe the movements of faith, but when I am thrown into the water, I swim, it is true, but I make other movements. I make the movements of infinity, whereas faith does the opposite. After having made the movements of infinity, it makes those of finiteness. Hail to him who can make those movements. He performs the marvelous, and I shall never grow tired of admiring him, whether he be Abraham or a slave in Abraham's house, whether he be a professor of philosophy or a servant girl. I look only at the movements, but at them I do look, and do not let myself be fooled, either by myself or by any other man. The knights of the infinite resignation are easily recognized, their gait is gliding and assured. Those on the other hand who carry the jewel of faith are likely to be delusive, because their outward appearance bears a striking resemblance to that which both the infinite resignation and faith profoundly despise. To Philistinism, I candidly admit that in my practice I have not found any reliable example of the knight of faith, though I would not therefore deny that every second man may be such an example. I have been trying, however, for several years to get on the track of this, and all in vain. People commonly travel around the world to see rivers and mountains, new stars, birds of rare plumage, queerly deformed fishes, ridiculous breeds of men. They abandon themselves to the bestial stupor which gapes at existence, and they think they have seen something. This does not interest me, but if I knew where there was such a knight of faith, I would make a pilgrimage to him on foot, for this prodigy interests me absolutely. I would not let go of him for an instant, every moment I would watch to see how he managed to make the movements. I would regard myself as secured for life. I would divide my time between looking at him and practicing the exercises myself, and thus would spend all my time admiring him. As was said, I have not found any such person, but I can well think him. Here he is. Acquaintance made, I am introduced to him. The moment I set eyes on him, I instantly push him from me. I myself leap backwards. I clasp my hands and say half aloud, "Good Lord, is this the man? Is it really he? Why, he looks like a tax collector. However, it is the man after all." I draw closer to him, watching his least movements to see whether there might not be visible a little heterogeneous fractional telegraphic message from the infinite. A glance, a look, a gesture, a note of sadness, a smile which betrayed the infinite in its heterogeneity with the finite. No, I examine his figure from tip to toe to see if there might not be a cranny through which the infinite was peeping. No, he is solid through and through. His tread, it is vigorous, belonging entirely to finiteness. No smartly dressed townsman who walks out to Fresberg on a Sunday afternoon treads the ground more firmly. He belongs entirely to the world, no Philistine more so. One can discover nothing of that aloof and superior nature whereby one recognizes the night of the infinite. He takes delight in everything, and whenever one sees him taking part in a particular pleasure, he does it with the persistence which is the mark of the earthly man whose soul is absorbed in such things. He tends to his work. So when one looks at him, one might suppose that he was a clerk who had lost his soul in an intricate system of bookkeeping. So precise is he. He takes a holiday on Sunday. He goes to church. No heavenly glance or any other token of the incommensurable betrays him. If one did not know him, it would be impossible to distinguish him from the rest of the congregation, for he is healthy and vigorous. Him singing proves at the most that he has a good chest. In the afternoon he walks to the forest. He takes delight in everything he sees, in the human swarm, in the new omnibuses, in the water of the Sound. When one meets him on the beach road, one might suppose he was a shopkeeper taking his flint. That's just the way he disports himself, for he is not a poet, and I have sought in vain to detect in him the poetic incommensurability. Toward evening he walks home. His gait is as indefatigable as that of the postman. On his way he reflects that his wife has surely a special little warm dish prepared for him, e.g., a calf's head roasted, garnished with vegetables. If he were to meet a man like-minded, he could continue as far as East Gate to discourse with him about that dish, with a passion befitting a hotel chef. As it happens, he hasn't 4 pence to his name, and yet he fully and firmly believes that his wife has that dainty dish for him. If she had it, it would then be an invidious sight for superior people and an inspiring one for the plain man to see him eat, for his appetite is greater than Esau's. His wife hasn't it. Strangely enough, it is quite the same to him. On the way he runs across another man. They talk together for a moment. In the twinkling of an eye he erects a new building. He has at his disposition all the powers necessary for it. The stranger leaves him with the thought that he certainly was a capitalist, while my admired knight thinks, yes, if the money were needed, I dare say I could get it. He lounges at an open window and looks out on the square on which he lives. He is interested in everything that goes on, in a rat which slips under the curb, in the children's play, and this with the nonchalance of a girl of 16. And yet he is no genius, for in vain I have sought in him the incommensurability of genius. In the evening he smokes his pipe. To look at him one would swear that it was the grocer over the way vegetating in the twilight. He lives as carefree as a ne'er-do-well, and yet he buys up the acceptable time at the dearest price, for he does not do the least thing except by virtue of the absurd. And yet I could become furious over it, for envy if for no other reason, because the man has made at every instant is making the movements of infinity. With infinite resignation he has drained the cup of life's profound sadness. He knows the bliss of the infinite. He senses the pain of renouncing everything, the dearest things he possesses in the world, and yet finiteness tastes to him just as good as to one who never knew anything higher, for his continuance in the finite did not bear a trace of the cowed and fearful spirit produced by the process of training, and yet he has this sense of security in enjoying it, as though the finite life were the surest thing of all. And yet the whole earthly form he exhibits is a new creation by virtue of the absurd. He resigned everything infinitely, and then he grasped everything again by virtue of the absurd. He constantly makes the movements of infinity, but he does this with such correctness and assurance that he constantly gets the finite out of it, and there is not a second when one has a notion of anything else. It is supposed to be the most difficult task for a dancer to leap into a definite posture in such a way that there is not a second when he is grasping after the posture, but by the leap itself he stands fixed in that posture. Perhaps no dancer can do it. That is what this knight does. Most people lie dejectedly in worldly sorrow and joy. They are the ones who sit along the wall and do not join in the dance. The knights of infinity are dancers and possess elevation. They make the movements upward and fall down again, and this too is no mean pastime nor ungraceful to behold. But whenever they fall down, they are not able at once to assume the posture. They vacillate an instant, and this vacillation shows that after all they are strangers in the world. This is more or less strikingly evident in proportion to the art they possess, but even the most artistic knights cannot altogether conceal this vacillation. One need not look at them when they are up in the air, but only the instant they touch or have touched the ground, then one recognizes them. But to be able to fall down in such a way that the same second it looks as if one were standing and walking, to transform the leap of life into a walk, absolutely to express the sublime and the pedestrian, that only these knights can do, and this is the one and only prodigy. But since the prodigy is so likely to be delusive, I will describe the movements in a definite instance which will serve to illustrate their relation to reality, for upon this everything turns. A young swain falls in love with a princess, and the whole content of his life consists in this love, and yet the situation is such that it is impossible for it to be realized, impossible for it to be translated from ideality into reality. The slaves of paltriness, the frogs in life's swamp, will naturally cry out, such a love is foolishness. The rich brewer's widow is a match fully as good and respectable. Let them croak in the swamp undisturbed. It is not so with the knight of infinite resignation. He does not give up his love, not for all the glory of the world. He is no fool. First, he makes sure that this really is the content of his life, and his soul is too healthy and too proud to squander the least thing upon an inebriation. He is not cowardly. He is not afraid of letting love creep into his most secret, his most hidden thoughts, to let it twine in innumerable coils about every ligament of his consciousness. If the love becomes an unhappy love, he will never be able to tear himself loose from it. He feels a blissful rapture in letting love tingle through every nerve, and yet his soul is as solemn as that of the man who has drained the poisoned goblet and feels how the juice permeates every drop of blood, for this instant is life and death. So when he has thus sucked into himself the whole of love, and absorbed himself in it, he does not lack courage to make trial of everything and to venture everything. He surveys the situation of his life, he convokes the swift thoughts which like tame doves obey his every bidding. He waves his wand over them, and they dart off in all directions. But when they all return, all as messengers of sorrow, and declare to him that it is an impossibility, then he becomes quiet, he dismisses them, he remains alone, and then he performs the movements. If what I am saying is to have any significance, it is requisite that the movement come about normally. To this end, passion is necessary. Every movement of infinity comes about by passion, and no reflection can bring a movement about. This is the continual leap in existence which explains the movement, whereas it is a chimera which according to Hegel is supposed to explain everything, and at the same time this is the only thing he has never tried to explain. Even to make the well-known somatic distinction between what one understands and what one does not understand, passion is required, and of course even more to make the characteristic Socratic movement, the movement, namely of ignorance. What our age lacks, however, is not reflection but passion. Hence, in a sense, our age is too tenacious of life to die, for dying is one of the most remarkable leaps, and a little verse of a poet has always attracted me much, because, after having expressed prettily and simply in 5 or 6 preceding lines his wish for good things in life, he concludes thus, Ein Selage sprung in die Uike. So for the first thing, the knight will have power to concentrate the whole content of life and the whole significance of reality in one single wish. If a man lacks this concentration, this intensity, if his soul from the beginning is dispersed in the multifarious, he never comes to the point of making the movement. He will deal shrewdly in life like the capitalists who invest their money in all sorts of securities, so as to gain on the one what they lose on the other. In short, he is not a knight. In the next place, the knight will have the power to concentrate the whole result of the operations of thought in one act of consciousness. If he lacks this intensity, if his soul from the beginning is dispersed in the multifarious, he will never get time to make the movements. He will be constantly running errands in life, never enter into eternity, for even at the instant when he is closest to it, he will suddenly discover that he has forgotten something for which he must go back. He will think that to enter eternity is possible the next instant, and that also is perfectly true, but by such considerations one never reaches the point of making the movements, but by their aid one sinks deeper and deeper into the mire. So the knight makes the movement. But what movement? Will he forget the whole thing? No, for the knight does not contradict himself, and it is a contradiction to forget the whole content of one's life and yet remain the same man, to become another man. A blissful leap into eternity. He feels no inclination, nor does he by any means regard this as greatness. Only the lower natures forget themselves and become something new. Thus, the butterfly has entirely forgotten that it was a caterpillar. Perhaps it may in turn so entirely forget it was a butterfly that it becomes a fish. The deeper natures never forget themselves and never become anything else than what they were. So the knight remembers everything. But precisely this remembrance is pain, and yet by the infinite resignation he is reconciled with existence. Love for that princess became for him the expression for an eternal love, assumed a religious character, was transfigured into a love for the eternal being, which did to be sure deny him the fulfillment of his love, yet reconciled him again by the eternal consciousness of its validity in the form of eternity, which no reality can take from him. Fools and young men prate about everything being possible for a man. That, however, is a great error. Spiritually speaking, everything is possible, but in the world of the finite there is much which is not possible. This impossible, however, the knight makes possible by expressing it spiritually, but he expresses it spiritually by waiving his claim to it. The wish which would carry him out into reality, but was wrecked upon the impossibility, is now bent inward, but it is not therefore lost, neither is it forgotten. At one moment it is the obscure emotion of the wish within him which awakens recollections. At another moment he awakens them himself, for he is too proud to be willing that what was the whole content of his life should be the thing of a fleeting moment. He keeps this love young, and along with him it increases in years and in beauty. On the other hand, he has no need of the intervention of the finite for the further growth of his love. From the instant he made the movement, the princess is lost to him. He has no need of those erotic tinglings in the nerves at the sight of the beloved, etc. Nor does he need to be constantly taking leave of her in a finite sense, because he recollects her in an eternal sense, and he knows very well that the lovers who are so bent upon seeing her yet once again, to say farewell for the last time, are right in being bent upon it, are right in thinking that it is the last time, for they forget one another the soonest. He has comprehended the deep secret that also in loving another person one must be sufficient unto oneself. He no longer takes a finite interest in what the princess is doing, and precisely this is proof that he has made the movement infinitely. Here one may have an opportunity to see whether the movement on the part of a particular person is true or fictitious. There was one who also believed that he had made the movement. But lo, time passed, the princess did something else. She married a prince, let us say, then his soul lost the elasticity of resignation. Thereby he knew that he had not made the movement rightly, for he who has made the act of resignation infinitely is sufficient unto himself. The knight does not annul his resignation. He preserves his love just as young as it was in its first moment. He never lets it go from him, precisely because he makes the movements infinitely. What the princess does cannot disturb him. It is only the lower natures which find in other people the law for their actions, which find the premises for their actions outside themselves. If on the other hand the princess is like-minded, the beautiful consequence will be apparent. She will introduce herself into that order of knighthood into which one is not received by balloting, but of which everyone is a member who has courage to introduce himself. That order of knighthood which proves its immortality by the fact that it makes no distinction between man and woman. The two will preserve their love young and sound. She also will have triumphed over her pains, even though she does not, as it is said in the ballad, lie every night beside her lord. These two will to all eternity remain in agreement with one another with a well-timed harmonia priestability, so that if ever the moment were to come, the moment which does not, however, concern them finitely, if ever the moment were to come which offered to give love its expression in time, then they will be capable of beginning precisely at the point where they would have begun if originally they had been united. He who understands this, be he man or woman, can never be deceived, for it is only the lower natures which imagine they were deceived. No girl who is not so proud really knows how to love, but if she is so proud, then the cunning and shrewdness of all the world cannot deceive her. In the infinite resignation there is peace and rest. Every man who will, who has not abased himself by scorning himself, can train himself to make these movements. The infinite resignation is that shirt we read about in the old fable. The thread is spun under tears, the cloth bleached with tears, the shirt sewn with tears, but then too it is a better protection than iron and steel. The imperfection in the fable is that a third party can manufacture this shirt. The secret in life is that everyone must sew it for himself, and the astonishing thing is that a man can sew it fully as well as a woman. In the infinite resignation there is peace and rest, and comfort in sorrow, that is, if the movement is made normally. It would not be difficult for me, however, to write a whole book were I to examine the various misunderstandings, the preposterous attitudes, the deceptive movements, which I have encountered in my brief practice. People believe very little in spirit, and yet making these movements depends upon spirit. It depends upon whether this is not a one-sided result of a direct necessitas, and if this is present, the more dubious it always is whether the movement is normal. If one means by this that the cold, unfruitful necessity must necessarily be present, one thereby affirms that no one can experience death before he actually dies, and that appears to me a crass materialism. However, in our time, people concern themselves rather little about making pure movements. In case one who was about to learn to dance were to say, for centuries, now one generation after another has been learning positions. It is high time I drew some advantage out of this and began straightway with the French dances. Then people would laugh at him, but in the world of spirit they find this exceedingly plausible. What is education? I should suppose that education was the curriculum one had to run through in order to catch up with oneself. And he who will not pass through this curriculum is helped very little by the fact that he was born in the most enlightened age. The infinite resignation is the last stage prior to faith, so that one who has not made this movement has not faith. For only in the infinite resignation do I become clear to myself with respect to my eternal validity, and only then can there be any question of grasping existence by virtue of faith. Now we will let the Knight of Faith appear in the role just described. He makes exactly the same movements as the other knight, infinitely renounces claim to the love which is the content of his life. He is reconciled in pain. But then occurs the prodigy. He makes still another movement more wonderful than all, for he says, I believe nevertheless that I shall get her in virtue. That is, of the absurd, in virtue of the fact that with God all things are possible. The absurd is not one of the factors which can be discriminated within the proper compass of the understanding. It is not identical with the improbable, the unexpected, the unforeseen. At the moment when the knight made the act of resignation, he was convinced, humanly speaking, of the impossibility. This was the result reached by the understanding, and he had sufficient energy to think it. On the other hand, in an infinite sense it was possible, namely, by renouncing it. But this sort of possessing is at the same time a relinquishing, and yet there is no absurdity in this for the understanding. For the understanding continued to be in the right in affirming that in the world of the finite where it holds sway this was and remained an impossibility. This is quite as clear to the Knight of Faith, so the only thing that can save him is the absurd, and this he grasps by faith. So he recognizes the impossibility, and that very instant he believes the absurd, for if without recognizing the impossibility with all the passion of his soul, and with all his heart, he should wish to imagine that he has faith, he deceives himself and his testimony has no bearing, since he has not even reached the infinite resignation. Faith therefore is not an aesthetic emotion, but something far higher, precisely because it has resignation as its presupposition. It is not an immediate instinct of the heart, but is the paradox of life and existence. So when in spite of all difficulties a young girl still remains convinced that her wish will surely be fulfilled, this conviction is not the assurance of faith, even if she was brought up by Christian parents, and for a whole year perhaps has been catechized by the parson. She is convinced in all her childish naivete and innocence. This conviction also ennobles her nature and imparts to her a preternatural greatness, so that like a thaumaturge she is able to conjure the finite powers of existence and make the very stones weep, while on the other hand in her flurry she may just as well run to Herod as to Pilate and move the whole world by her tears. Her conviction is very lovable, and one can learn much from her, but one thing is not to be learned from her: one does not learn the movements, for her conviction does not dare in the pain of resignation to face the impossibility. So I can perceive that it requires strength and energy and freedom of spirit to make the infinite movements of resignation. I can also perceive that it is feasible. But the next thing astonishes me, it makes my head swim, for after having made the movement of resignation, then by virtue of the absurd to get everything, to get the wish whole and uncurtailed, that is beyond human power, it is a prodigy. But this I can perceive, that the young girl's conviction is mere levity in comparison with the firmest faith displays notwithstanding it has perceived the impossibility. Whenever I essay to make this movement, I turn giddy. The very instant I am admiring it, absolutely a prodigious dread grips my soul. For what is it to tempt God? And yet this movement is the movement of faith, and remains such, even though philosophy, in order to confuse the concepts, would make us believe that it has faith, and even though theology would sell out faith at a bargain price. For the act of resignation, faith is not required, for what I gain by resignation is my eternal consciousness, and this is a purely philosophical movement which I dare say I am able to make if it is required, and which I can train myself to make, for whenever any finiteness would get the mastery over me, I starve myself until I can make the movement. For my eternal consciousness is my love to God, and for me this is higher than everything. For the act of resignation, faith is not required, but it is needed when it is the case of acquiring the very least thing more than my eternal consciousness, for this is the paradoxical. The movements are frequently confounded, For it is said that one needs faith to renounce the claim to everything. Yea, a stranger thing than this may be heard, when a man laments the loss of his faith. And when one looks at the scale to see where he is, one sees, strangely enough, that he has only reached the point where he should make the infinite movement of resignation. In resignation I make renunciation of everything. This movement I make by myself, and if I do not make it, it is because I am cowardly and effeminate, and without enthusiasm, and do not feel the significance of the lofty dignity which is assigned to every man, that of being his own censor, which is a far prouder title than that of censor general to the whole Roman Republic. This movement I make by myself, and what I gain is myself in my eternal consciousness, in blissful agreement with my love for the eternal being. By faith I make renunciation of nothing, on the contrary, by faith I acquire everything, precisely in the sense in which it is said that he who has faith like a grain of mustard can remove mountains. A purely human courage is required to renounce the whole of the temporal to gain the eternal, but this I gain, and to all eternity I cannot renounce it. That is a self-contradiction. But a paradox enters in, and a humble courage is required to grasp the whole of the temporal by virtue of the absurd, and this is the courage of faith. By faith Abraham did not renounce his claim upon Isaac, but by faith he got Isaac. By virtue of resignation that rich young man should have given away everything, but then when he had done that, the knight of faith should have said to him, by virtue of the absurd thou shalt get every penny back again. Canst thou believe that? And this speech ought by no means to have been indifferent to the aforesaid rich young man, for in case he gave away his goods because he was tired of them, his resignation was not much to boast of. It is about the temporal, the finite, everything turns in this case. I am able by my own strength to renounce everything, and then to find peace and repose in pain. I can stand everything, even though that horrible demon, more dreadful than death, the king of terrors, even though madness were to hold up before my eyes the motley of the fool, and I understood by its look that it was I who must put it on, I still am able to save my soul, if only it is more to me than my earthly happiness that my love to God should triumph in me. A man may still be able at the last instant to concentrate his whole soul in a single glance toward that heaven from which cometh every good gift, and his glance will be intelligible to himself and also to him whom it seeks as a sign that he nevertheless remained true to his love. Then he will calmly put on the motley garb. He whose soul has not this romantic enthusiasm has sold his soul, whether he got a kingdom for it or a paltry piece of silver. But by my own strength I am not able to get the least of the things which belong to finiteness, for I am constantly using my strength to renounce everything. By my own strength I am able to give up the princess, and I shall not become a grumbler, but shall find joy and repose in my pain. But by my own strength I am not able to get her again, for I am employing all my strength to be resigned. But by faith, says that marvelous knight, by faith I shall get her in virtue of the absurd. So this movement I am unable to make. As soon as I would begin to make it, everything turns around dizzily, and I flee back to the pain of resignation. I can swim in existence, but for this mystical soaring I am too heavy. To exist in such a way that my opposition to existence is expressed as the most beautiful, and assured harmony is something I cannot do. And yet it must be glorious to get the princess. That is what I say every instant. And the knight of resignation who does not say it is a deceiver. He has not had one only wish, and he has not kept the wish young by his pain. Perhaps there was one who thought it fitting enough that the wish was no longer beaded, that the barb of pain was dull. But such a man is no knight. A free-born soul who caught himself entertaining such thoughts would despise himself, and begin over again. Above all, he would not permit his soul to be deceived by itself. And yet it must be glorious to get the princess, and yet the knight of faith is the only happy one, the heir apparent to the finite, whereas the knight of resignation is a stranger and a foreigner. Thus to get the princess, to live with her joyfully and happily day in and day out, thus to live joyfully and happily every instant by virtue of the absurd, every instant to see the sword hanging over the head of the beloved, and yet to find repose in the pain of resignation. But joy by virtue of the absurd, this is marvelous. He who does it is great, the only great man. The thought of it stirs my soul, which never was niggardly in the admiration of greatness. In case then everyone in my generation who will not stop at faith is really a man who has comprehended life's horror, who has understood what doubt means when he says that a soldier who stands alone at his post with a loaded gun in a stormy night beside a powder magazine will get strange thoughts into his head. In case then everyone who will not stop at faith is a man who had strength of soul to comprehend that the wish was an impossibility, and thereupon gave himself time to remain alone with this thought. In case everyone who will not stop at faith is a man who is reconciled in pain, and is reconciled to pain. In case everyone who will not stop at faith is a man who in the next place did the marvelous thing, grasped the whole of existence by virtue of the absurd. Then what I write is the highest eulogy of my contemporaries by one of the lowliest among them, who was able only to make the movements of resignation. But why will they not stop at faith? Why does one sometimes hear that people are ashamed to acknowledge that they have faith? This I cannot comprehend. If ever I contrive to be able to make this movement, I shall in the future ride in a coach and four. If it is really true that all the Philistinism I behold in life is not what it seems to be, is it the miracle? That is conceivable, for the hero of faith had in fact a striking resemblance to it, for that hero of faith was not so much an ironist or a humorist, but something far higher. Much is said in our age about irony and humor, especially by people who have never been capable of engaging in the practice of these arts, but who nevertheless know how to explain everything. I am not entirely unacquainted with these two passions. I know a little more about them than what is to be found in German and German-Danish compendiums. I know therefore that these two passions are essentially different from the passion of faith. Irony and humor reflect also upon themselves, and therefore belong within the sphere of the infinite resignation. Their elasticity is due to the fact that the individual is incommensurable with reality. The last movement, the paradoxical movement of faith, I cannot make, in spite of the fact that I would do it more than gladly. Whether a man has a right to make this affirmation must be left to him. It is a question between him and the eternal being who is the object of faith, whether in this respect he can hit upon an amicable compromise. What every man can do is to make the movement of infinite resignation, and I for my part would not hesitate to pronounce everyone cowardly who wishes to make himself believe he can do it. With faith it is a different matter, but what every man has not a right to do is to make others believe that faith is something lowly or that it is an easy thing, whereas it is the greatest and the hardest. People construe the story of Abraham in another way. They extol God's grace in bestowing Isaac upon him again. The whole thing was only a trial. A trial, that word may say much or little, and yet the whole thing is over as quickly as it is said. One mounts a winged horse, the same instant one is at Mount Moriah, the same instant one sees the ram, one forgets that Abraham rode only upon an ass, which walks slowly along the road, that he had a journey of 3 days, that he needed some time to cleave the wood, to bind Isaac, and to sharpen the knife. And yet they extol Abraham. He who is to deliver the discourse can very well sleep till a quarter of an hour before he has to preach. The auditor can well take a nap during the discourse, for all goes smoothly, without the least trouble from any quarter. If there was a man present who suffered from insomnia, perhaps he then went home and sat in a corner and thought, it's an affair of a moment. This whole thing, if only you wait a minute, you see the ram, and the trial is over. If the orator were to encounter him in this condition, he would, I think, confront him with all his dignity and say, wretched man, that thou couldst let thy soul sink into such foolishness. No miracle occurs. The whole of life is a trial. In proportion as the orator proceeds with his outpouring, he would get more and more excited, would become more and more delighted with himself. And whereas he had noticed no congestion of the blood while he talked about Abraham, he now felt how the nerves swelled in his forehead. Perhaps he would have lost his breath as well as his tongue if the sitter had answered calmly and with dignity, but it was about this you preached last Sunday. Let us then either consign Abraham to oblivion, or let us learn to be dismayed by the tremendous paradox which constitutes the significance of Abraham's life, that we may understand that our age, like every age, can be joyful if it has faith. In case Abraham is not a nullity, a phantom, a show one employs for a pastime, then the fault can never consist in the fact that the sinner wants to do likewise. But the point is to see how great a thing it was that Abraham did, in order that man may judge for himself whether he has the call and the courage to be subjected to such a test. The comic contradiction in the behavior of the orator is that he reduced Abraham to an insignificance, and yet would admonish the other to behave in the same way. Should not one dare then to talk about Abraham? I think one should. If I were to talk about him, I would first depict the pain of his trial. To that end I would like a leech suck all the dread and distress and torture out of a father's sufferings, so that I might describe what Abraham suffered, whereas all the while he nevertheless believed. I would remind the audience that the journey lasted 3 days and a good part of the 4th, yea, that these 3.5 days were infinitely longer than the few thousand years which separate me from Abraham. Then I would remind them that, in my opinion, every man dares still turn around ere he begins such an undertaking, and every instant he can repentantly turn back. If the hearer does this, I fear no danger, nor am I afraid of awakening in people an inclination to be tried like Abraham. But if one would dispose of a cheap edition of Abraham, and yet admonish everyone to do likewise, then it is ludicrous. It is now my intention to draw out from the story of Abraham the dialectical consequences inherent in it, expressing them in the form of problemata, in order to see what a tremendous paradox faith is. A paradox which is capable of transforming a murder into a holy act well-pleasing to God. A paradox which gives Isaac back to Abraham, which no thought can master, because faith begins precisely there where thinking leaves off. Problem 1. Is there such a thing as a teleological suspension of the ethical? The ethical as such is the universal, it applies to everyone, and the same thing is expressed from another point of view by saying that it applies every instant. It reposes immanently in itself, it has nothing without itself which is its telos, but is itself telos for everything outside it, and when this has been incorporated by the ethical it can go no further. Conceived immediately as physical and psychical, the particular individual is the particular which has its telos in the universal, and its task is to express itself constantly in it, to abolish its particularity in order to become the universal. As soon as the individual would assert himself in his particularity over against the universal, he sins, and only by recognizing this can he again reconcile himself with the universal. Whenever the individual after he has entered the universal feels an impulse to assert himself as the particular, he is in temptation, and he can labor himself out of this only by abandoning himself as the particular in the universal. If this be the highest thing that can be said of man, and of his existence, then the ethical has the same character as man's eternal blessedness, which to all eternity and at every instant is his telos, since it would be a contradiction to say that this might be abandoned, inasmuch as this is no sooner suspended than it is forfeited, whereas in other cases when it is suspended is not forfeited, but is preserved precisely in that higher thing which is its telos. If such be the case, then Hegel is right when in his chapter on the good and the conscience, he characterizes man merely as the particular and regards this character as a moral form of the evil which is to be annulled in the teleology of the moral, so that the individual who remains in this stage is either sinning or subjected to temptation. On the other hand, he is wrong in talking of faith, wrong in not protesting loudly and clearly against the fact that Abraham enjoys honor and glory as the father of faith, whereas he ought to be prosecuted and convicted of murder. For faith is this paradox, that the particular is higher than the universal, yet in such a way, be it observed, that the movement repeats itself, and that consequently the individual, after having been in the universal, now as the particular isolated himself as higher than the universal. If this be not faith, then Abraham is lost, then faith has never existed in the world, because it has always existed. For if the ethical is the highest thing, and if nothing incommensurable remains in man in any other way but as the evil, then one needs no other categories besides those which the Greeks possessed, or which by consistent thinking can be derived from them. This fact Hegel ought not to have concealed, for after all he was acquainted with Greek thought. One not infrequently hears it said by men who for lack of losing themselves in studies are absorbed in phrases that a light shines upon the Christian world whereas a darkness broods over paganism. This utterance has always seemed strange to me, inasmuch as every profound thinker and every serious artist is even in our day rejuvenated by the eternal youth of the Greek race. Such an utterance may be explained by the consideration that people do not know what they ought to say but only that they must say something. It is quite right for one to say that paganism did not possess faith, but if with this one is to have said something, one must be a little clearer about what one understands by faith, since otherwise one falls back into such phrases. To explain the whole of existence and faith along with it is easy, and that man does not make the poorest calculation in life who reckons upon admiration when he possesses such an explanation. For, as Boileau says, unsought truth thunders on plus sought qui elle admire. Faith is precisely this paradox, that the individual as the particular is higher than the universal, is justified over against it, is not subordinate but superior, yet in such a way, be it observed, and it is the particular individual who, after he has been subordinated as the particular to the universal, now through the universal becomes the individual who as the particular is superior to the universal, for the fact that the individual as the particular stands in an absolute relation to the absolute. This position cannot be mediated, for all mediation comes about precisely by virtue of the universal. It is and remains to all eternity a paradox, inaccessible to thought. And yet faith is this paradox, or else there never has been faith, precisely because it always has been. In other words, Abraham is lost. That for the particular individual this paradox may easily be mistaken for a temptation is indeed true, but one ought not for this reason to conceal it. That the whole constitution of many persons may be such that this paradox repels them is indeed true, but one ought not for this reason to make faith something different in order to be able to possess it, but ought rather to admit that one does not possess it, whereas those who possess faith should take care to set up certain criteria so that one might distinguish the paradox from a temptation. Now the story of Abraham contains such a teleological suspension of the ethical. There have not been lacking clever pathés and profound investigators who have found analogies to it. Their wisdom is derived from the pretty proposition that at bottom everything is the same. If one will look a little more closely, I have not much doubt that in the whole world one will not find a single analogy, if it stands fast that Abraham is the representative of faith, and that faith is normally expressed in him whose life is not merely the most paradoxical that can be thought but so paradoxical that it cannot be thought at all. He acts by virtue of the absurd, for it is precisely absurd that he as the particular is higher than the universal. This paradox cannot be mediated, for as soon as he begins to do this, he has to admit that he was in temptation, and if such was the case, he never gets to the point of sacrificing Isaac, or if he has sacrificed Isaac, he must turn back repentantly to the universal. By virtue of the absurd, he gets Isaac again. Abraham is therefore at no instant a tragic hero but something quite different, either a murderer or a believer. The middle term which saves the tragic hero, Abraham has not. Hence it is that I can understand the tragic hero but cannot understand Abraham, though in a certain crazy sense I admire him more than all other men. Abraham's relation to Isaac, ethically speaking, is quite simply expressed by saying that a father shall love his son more dearly than himself. Yet within its own compass the ethical has various gradations. Let us see whether in this story there is to be found any higher expression for the ethical, such as would ethically explain his conduct, ethically justify him in suspending the ethical obligation toward his son, without in this search going beyond the teleology of the ethical. When an undertaking in which a whole nation is concerned is hindered. 6. When such an enterprise is brought to a standstill by the disfavor of heaven. When the angry deity sends a calm which mocks all efforts. When the seer performs his heavy task and proclaims that deity demands a young maiden as a sacrifice, then will the father heroically make the sacrifice. He will magnanimously conceal his pain. The Trojan War. When the Greek fleet was unable to set sail from Aulis because of an adverse wind, the seer conscience announced that King Agamemnon had offended Artemis, and that the goddess demanded his daughter Iphigenia as a sacrifice, though he might wish that he were the lowly man who dares to weep, not the king who must act royally. And though solitary pain forces its way into his breast, he has only 3 confidants among the people. Yet soon the whole nation will be cognizant of his pain, but also cognizant of his exploit, that for the welfare of the whole he was willing to sacrifice her, his daughter, the lovely young maiden. O charming bosom, all beautiful cheeks, all bright golden hair, and the daughter will affect him by her tears, and the father will turn his face away, but the hero will raise the knife. When the report of this reaches the ancestral home, then will the beautiful maidens of Greece blush with enthusiasm, and if the daughter was betrothed, her true love will not be angry but be proud of sharing in the father's deed, because the maiden belonged to him more feelingly than to the father. When the intrepid Judge 8 who saved Israel in the hour of need in one breath binds himself and God by the same vow, then heroically the young maiden's jubilation, the beloved daughter's joy, he will turn to sorrow, and with her all Israel will lament her maiden youth. But every free-born man every stout-hearted woman will admire Jephthah, and every maiden in Israel will wish to act as did his daughter. For what good would it do if Jephthah were victorious by reason of his vow if he did not keep it? Would not the victory again be taken from the nation? When a son is forgetful of his duty, when the state entrusts the father with the sword of justice, when the laws require punishment at the hand of the father, then will the father heroically forget that the guilty one is his son. He will magnanimously conceal his pain, but there will not be a single one among the people, not even the son, who will not admire the father, and whenever the law of Rome is interpreted, it will be remembered that many interpreted it more learnedly, but none so gloriously as Brutus. If, on the other hand, while a favorable wind bore the fleet on with swelling sails to its goal, Agamemnon had sent that messenger who fetched Iphigenia in order to be sacrificed, if Jephthah, without being bound by any vow which decided the fate of the nation, had said to his daughter, "Bewail now thy virginity for the space of 2 months, for I will sacrifice thee," if Brutus had had a righteous son and yet would have ordered the lictors to execute him, who would have understood them? If these 3 men had replied to the query why they did it by saying, "It is a trial in which we are tested," would people have understood them better? When Agamemnon, Jephthah, Brutus at the decisive moment heroically overcome their pain, have heroically lost the beloved and have merely to accomplish the outward sacrifice, then there never will be a noble soul in the world who will not shed tears of compassion for their pain and of admiration for their exploit. If, on the other hand, these 3 men at the decisive moment were to adjoin to their heroic conduct this little word, "but for all that it will not come to pass," who then would understand them? If as an explanation they added, "This we believe by virtue of the absurd," who would understand them better? For who would not easily understand that it was absurd, but who would understand that one could then believe it? The sons of Brutus, while their father was consul, took part in a conspiracy to restore the king Rome had expelled, and Brutus ordered them put to death. The difference between the tragic hero and Abraham is clearly evident. The tragic hero still remains within the ethical. He lets one expression of the ethical find its telos in a higher expression of the ethical relation between father and son, or daughter and father. He reduces to a sentiment which has its dialectic in the idea of morality. Here there can be no question of a teleological suspension of the ethical. With Abraham the situation was different. By his act he overstepped the ethical entirely and possessed a higher telos outside of it, in relation to which he suspended the former. For I should very much like to know how one would bring Abraham's act into relation with the universal, and whether it is possible to discover any connection whatever between what Abraham did and the universal, except the fact that he transgressed it. It was not for the sake of saving a people, not to maintain the idea of the state, that Abraham did this, and not in order to reconcile angry deities. If there could be a question of the deity being angry, he was angry only with Abraham, and Abraham's whole action stands in no relation to the universal, is a purely personal undertaking. Therefore, whereas the tragic hero is great by reason of his moral virtue, Abraham is great by reason of a personal virtue. In Abraham's light there is no higher expression for the ethical than this, that the father shall love his son. Of the ethical in the sense of morality there can be no question in this instance. In so far as the universal was present, it was indeed cryptically present in Isaac, hidden as it were in Isaac's loins, and must therefore cry out with Isaac's mouth, "Do it not." Thou art bringing everything to naught. Why then did Abraham do it? For God's sake, and for his own sake. He did it for God's sake because God required this proof of his faith. For his own sake he did it in order that he might furnish the proof. The unity of these two points of view is perfectly expressed by the word which has always been used to characterize this situation. It is a trial, a temptation. A temptation. But what does that mean? What ordinarily tempts a man is that which would keep him from doing his duty, but in this case the temptation is itself the ethical, which would keep him from doing God's will. Here is evident the necessity of a new category if one would understand Abraham. Such a relationship to the deity paganism did not know. The tragic hero does not enter into any private relationship with the deity, but for him the ethical is the divine, hence the paradox implied in his situation can be mediated in the universal. Abraham cannot be mediated, and the same thing can be expressed also by saying that he cannot talk. So soon as I talk I express the universal, and if I do not do so, no one can understand me. Therefore, if Abraham would express himself in terms of the universal, he must say that his situation is a temptation, for he has no higher expression for that universal which stands above the universal which he transgresses. Therefore, though Abraham arouses my admiration, he at the same time appalls me. He who denies himself and sacrifices himself for duty gives up the finite in order to grasp the infinite, and that man is secure enough. The tragic hero gives up the certain for the still more certain, and the eye of the beholder rests upon him confidently. But he who gives up the universal in order to grasp something still higher which is not the universal, what is he doing? Is it possible that this can be anything else but a temptation? And if it be possible, but the individual was mistaken, what can save him? He suffers all the pain of the tragic hero, he brings to naught his joy in the world, he renounces everything, and perhaps at the same instant debars himself from the sublime joy which to him was so precious that he would purchase it at any price. Him the beholder cannot understand nor let his eye rest confidently upon him. Perhaps it is not possible to do what the believer proposes, since it is indeed unthinkable. Or if it could be done, but if the individual had misunderstood the deity, what can save him? The tragic hero has need of tears and claims them, and where is the envious eye which would be so barren that it could not weep with Agamemnon? But where is the man with a soul so bewildered that he would have the presumption to weep for Abraham? The tragic hero accomplishes his act at a definite instant in time, but in the course of time he does something not less significant. He visits the man whose soul is beset with sorrow, whose breast for stifled sobs cannot draw breath, whose thoughts pregnant with tears weigh heavily upon him. To him he makes his appearance, dissolves the sorcery of sorrow, loosens his corselet, coaxes forth his tears by the fact that in his sufferings the sufferer forgets his own. One cannot weep over Abraham. One approaches him with a horror religiosus, as Israel approached Mount Sinai. If then the solitary man who ascends Mount Moriah, which with its peak rises heaven high above the plain of Olives, if he be not a somnambulist who walks securely above the abyss while he who is stationed at the foot of the mountain, and is looking on trembles with fear and out of reverence and dread dare not even call to him. If this man is disordered in his mind, if he had made a mistake, thanks and thanks again to him who proffers to the man whom the sorrows of life have assaulted and left naked, proffers to him the fig leaf of the word with which he can cover his wretchedness. Thanks be to thee, great Shakespeare, who art able to express everything, absolutely everything, precisely as it is, and yet why didst thou never pronounce this ban? Didst thou perhaps reserve it to thyself, like the loved one whose name one cannot endure that the world should mention? For the poet purchases the power of words, the power of uttering all the dread secrets of others, at the price of a little secret he is unable to utter. And a poet is not an apostle, he casts out devils only by the power of the devil. But now when the ethical is thus teleologically suspended, how does the individual exist in whom it is suspended? He exists as the particular in opposition to the universal. Does he then sin? For this is the form of sin as seen in the idea, just as the infant, though it does not sin, because it is not as such yet conscious of its existence, yet its existence is seen as seen in the idea, and the ethical makes its demands upon it every instant. If one denies that this form can be repeated in such a way that it is not sin, then the sentence of condemnation is pronounced upon Abraham. How then did Abraham exist? He believed. This is the paradox which keeps him upon the sheer edge, and which he cannot make clear to any other man, for the paradox is that he as the individual puts himself in an absolute relation to the absolute. Is he justified in doing this? His justification is once more the paradox, for if he is justified, it is not by virtue of anything universal, but by virtue of being the particular individual. How then does the individual assure himself that he is justified? It is easy enough to level down the whole of existence to the idea of the state or the idea of society. If one does this, one can also mediate easily enough, for then one does not encounter at all the paradox that the individual as the individual is higher than the universal, which I can aptly express also by the thesis of Pythagoras, that the uneven numbers are more perfect than the even. If in our age one occasionally hears a rejoinder which is pertinent to the paradox, it is likely to be to the following effect: it is to be judged by the result. A hero who has become a scandalon to his contemporaries because they are conscious that he is a paradox who cannot make himself intelligible, will cry out defiantly to his generation, "The result will surely prove that I am justified." In our age we hear this cry rather seldom, for as our age, to its disadvantage, does not produce heroes, it has also the advantage of producing few caricatures. When in our age one hears this saying, it is to be judged according to the result. A man is at once clear as to who it is he has the honor of talking with. Those who talk thus are a numerous tribe, whom I will denominate by the common name of docents. In their thoughts they live secure in existence. They have a solid position and sure prospects in a well-ordered state. They have centuries and even millenniums between them and the concussions of existence. They do not fear that such things could recur, for what would the police say to that? And the newspapers. Their life work is to judge the great, and to judge them according to the result. Such behavior toward the great betrays a strange mixture of arrogance and misery, of arrogance because they think they are called to be judges, of misery because they do not feel that their lives are even in the remotest degree akin to the great. Surely a man who possesses even a little erectoris ingenii has not become entirely a cold and clammy mollusk, and when he approaches what is great it can never escape his mind that from the creation of the world it has been customary for the result to come last, and that, if one would truly learn anything from great actions, one must pay attention precisely to the beginning. In case he who should act were to judge himself according to the result, he would never get to the point of beginning. Even though the result may give joy to the whole world, it cannot help the hero, for he would get to know the result only when the whole thing was over, and it was not by this he became a hero, but he was such for the fact that he began. Moreover, the result is in its dialectic entirely heterogeneous with the existence of the hero. Or is it possible to prove that Abraham was justified in assuming the position of the individual with relation to the universal, for the fact that he got Isaac by miracle? If Abraham had actually sacrificed Isaac, would he then have been less justified? But people are curious about the result, as they are about the result in a book. They want to know nothing about dread, distress, the paradox. They flirt aesthetically with the result. It comes just as unexpectedly but also just as easily as a prize in the lottery, and when they have heard the result they are edified. And yet no robber of temples condemned to hard labor behind iron bars is so base a criminal as the man who pillages the holy. And even Judas who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver is not more despicable than the man who sells greatness. It is abhorrent to my soul to talk inhumanly about greatness, to let it loom darkly at a distance in an indefinite form, to make out that it is great without making the human character of it evident, wherewith it ceases to be great. For it is not what happens to me that makes me great, but it is what I do, and there is surely no one who thinks that a man became great because he won the great prize in the lottery. Even if a man were born in humble circumstances, I would require of him nevertheless that he should not be so inhuman toward himself as not to be able to think of the king's castle except at a remote distance, dreaming vaguely of its greatness and wanting at the same time to exalt it, and also to abolish it by the fact that he exalted it meanly. I require of him that he should be man enough to step forward confidently and worthily even in that place. He should not be unmanly enough to desire impudently to offend everybody by rushing straight from the street into the king's hall. By that he loses more than the king. On the contrary, He should find joy in observing every rule of propriety with a glad and confident enthusiasm which will make him frank and fearless. This is only a symbol, for the difference here remarked upon is only a very imperfect expression for spiritual distance. I require of every man that he should not think so inhumanly of himself as not to dare to enter those palaces where not merely the memory of the elect abides, but where the elect themselves abide. He should not press forward impudently and impute to them kinship with himself. On the contrary, he should be blissful every time he bows before them. But he should be frank and confident, and always be something more than a charwoman. For if he will not be more, he will never gain entrance. And what will help him is precisely the dread and distress by which the great are tried, for otherwise, if he has a bit of teeth in him, they will merely arouse his justified envy. And what distance alone makes great, what people would make great by empty and hollow phrases, that they themselves reduce to naught. Who was ever so great as that blessed woman, the Mother of God, the Virgin Mary? And yet how do we speak of her? We say that she was highly favored among women. And if it did not happen strangely that those who hear are able to think as inhumanly as those who talk, every young girl might well ask, why was not I too the highly favored? And if I had nothing else to say, I would not dismiss such a question as stupid, for when it is a matter of favor abstractly considered, everyone is equally entitled to it. What they leave out is the distress, the dread, the paradox. My thought is as pure as that of anyone, and the thought of the man who is able to think such things will surely become pure, and if this be not so, he may expect the dreadful, for he who once has evoked these images cannot be rid of them again, and if he sins against them, they avenge themselves with quiet wrath, more terrible than the vociferousness of 10 ferocious reviewers. To be sure, Mary bore the child miraculously, but it came to pass with her after the manner of women, and that season is one of dread, distress, and paradox. To be sure, the angel was a ministering spirit, but it was not a servile spirit which obliged her by saying to the other young maidens of Israel, despise not Mary. What befalls her is the extraordinary. But the angel came only to Mary, and no one could understand her. After all, what woman was so mortified as Mary? And is it not true in this instance also that one whom God blesses he curses in the same breath? This is the Spirit's interpretation of Mary, and she is not. She is not a fine lady who sits in state and plays with an infant God. Nevertheless, when she says, behold the handmaid of the Lord, then she is great, and I think it will not be found difficult to explain why she became the mother of God. She has no need of worldly admiration, any more than Abraham has need of tears, for she was not a heroine, and he was not a hero. But both of them became greater than such, not at all because they were exempted from distress and torment and paradox, but they became great through these. It is great when the poet, presenting his tragic hero before the admiration of men, dares to say, weep for him, for he deserves it. For it is great to deserve the tears of those who are worthy to shed tears. It is great that the poet dares to keep the crowd in awe, dares to castigate men, requiring that every man examine himself whether he be worthy to weep for the hero. For the waste water of blubberers is a degradation of the holy. But greater than all this it is that the knight of faith dares to say even to the noble man who would weep for him, weep not for me, but weep for thyself. One is deeply moved. One longs to be back in those beautiful times, as sweet yearning conducts one to the desired goal, to see Christ wandering in the promised land. One forgets the dread, the distress, the paradox. Was it so easy a matter not to be mistaken? Was it not dreadful that this man who walks among the others, was it not dreadful that he was God? Was it not dreadful to sit at table with him? Was it so easy a matter to become an apostle? But the result, 1800 years, that is a help. It helps to the shabby deceit wherewith one deceives oneself and others. I do not feel the courage to wish to be contemporary with such events, but hence I do not judge severely those who were mistaken, nor think meanly of those who saw right. I return, however, to Abraham. Before the result, either Abraham was every minute a murderer, or we are confronted by a paradox which is higher than all mediation. The story of Abraham contains therefore a teleological suspension of the ethical. As the individual, he became higher than the universal. This is the paradox which does not permit of mediation. It is just as inexplicable how he got into it as it is inexplicable how he remained in it. If such is not the position of Abraham, then he is not even a tragic hero but a murderer. To want to continue to call him the father of faith, to talk of this to people who do not concern themselves with anything but words, is thoughtless. A man can become a tragic hero by his own powers, but not a knight of faith. When a man enters upon the way, in a certain sense the hard way of the tragic hero, many will be able to give him counsel. To him who follows the narrow way of faith, no one can give counsel. Him no one can understand. Faith is a miracle, and yet no man is excluded from it, for that in which all human life is unified is passion, and faith is a passion. Times Lessing has somewhere given expression to a similar thought from a purely aesthetic point of view. What he would show expressly in this passage is that sorrow too can find a witty expression. To this end, he quotes a rejoinder of the unhappy English king Edward II. In contrast to this, he quotes from Diderot a story of a peasant woman, and a rejoinder of hers. Then he continues that too was wit, and the wit of a peasant at that, but the situation made it inevitable. Consequently, one must not seek to find the excuse for the witty expressions of pain and of sorrow in the fact that the person who uttered them. Problem 2, is there such a thing as an absolute duty toward God? The ethical is the universal, and as such it is again the divine. One has therefore a right to say that fundamentally every duty is a duty toward God. But if one cannot say more, then one affirms at the same time that properly I have no duty toward God. Duty becomes duty by being referred to God, but in duty itself I do not come into relation with God. Thus it is a duty to love one's neighbor, but in performing this duty I do not come into relation with God but with the neighbor whom I love. If I say then in this connection that it is my duty to love God, I am really uttering only a tautology, inasmuch as God is in this instance used in an entirely abstract sense as the divine, i.e., the universal, i.e., duty. So the whole existence of the human race is rounded off completely like a sphere, and the ethical is at once its limit and its content. God becomes an invisible vanishing point, a powerless thought, his power being only in the ethical, which is the content of existence. If in any way it might occur to any man to want to love God in any other sense than that here indicated, he is romantic. He loves a phantom which, if it had merely the power of being able to speak, would say to him, I do not require your love. Stay where you belong. If in any way it might occur to a man to want to love God otherwise, this love would be open to suspicion, like that of which Rousseau speaks, referring to people who love the Kafirs instead of their neighbors. So in case what has been expounded here is correct, in case there is no incommensurability in a human life, and what there is of the incommensurable is only such by an accident from which no consequences can be drawn, in so far as existence is regarded in terms of the idea, Hegel is right, but he is not right in talking about faith or in allowing Abraham to be regarded as the father of it, for by the latter he has pronounced judgment both upon Abraham and upon faith. In the Hegelian philosophy, das Äußere is higher than das Inner. This is frequently illustrated by an example. The child is das Inner, the man das Äußere. Hence it is that the child is defined by the outward, and, conversely, the man, as das Inner, is defined precisely by das Inner. Faith, on the contrary, is the paradox that inwardness is higher than outwardness, or, to recall an expression used above, the uneven number is higher than the even. In the ethical way of regarding life, it is therefore the task of the individual to divest himself of the inward determinants and express them in an outward way. Whenever he shrinks from this, whenever he is inclined to persist in or to slip back again into the inward determinants of feeling, mood, etc., he sins, he succumbs to a temptation. The paradox of faith is this, that there is an inwardness which is incommensurable for the outward, an inwardness, be it observed, which is not identical with the first but is a new inwardness. This must not be overlooked. Modern philosophy has taken the liberty of substituting without more ado the word faith for the immediate, when one does that it is ridiculous to deny that faith has existed in all ages. In that way, faith comes into rather simple company along with feeling, mood, idiosyncrasy, vapors, etc. To this extent, philosophy may be right in saying that one ought not to stop there. But there is nothing to justify philosophy in using this phrase with regard to faith. Before faith there goes A, was a superior person, well-educated, intelligent, and witty withal, for the passions make all men again equal. But the explanation is to be found in the fact that in all probability everyone would have said the same thing in the same situation. The thought of a peasant woman a queen could have had and must have had, just as what the king said in that instance a peasant too would have been able to say and doubtless would have said movement of infinity. And only then, unexpected, by virtue of the absurd, faith enters upon the scene. This I can well understand without maintaining on that account that I have faith. If faith is nothing but what philosophy makes it out to be, then Socrates already went further, much further, whereas the contrary is true, that he never reached it. In an intellectual respect he made the movement of infinity. His ignorance is infinite resignation. This task in itself is a match for human powers, even though people in our time disdain it, but only after it is done, only when the individual has evacuated himself in the infinite. Only then is the point attained where faith can break forth. The paradox of faith is this, that the individual is higher than the universal, that the individual determines his relation to the universal by his relation to the absolute, not his relation to the absolute by his relation to the universal. The paradox can also be expressed by saying that there is an absolute duty toward God, for in this relationship of duty the individual as an individual stands related absolutely to the absolute. So when in this connection it is said that it is a duty to love God, something different is said from that in the foregoing, for if this duty is absolute, the ethical is reduced to a position of relativity. From this, however, it does not follow that the ethical is to be abolished, but it acquires an entirely different expression, the paradoxical expression, that, for example, love to God may cause the knight of faith to give his love to his neighbor, the opposite expression to that which, ethically speaking, is required by duty. If such is not the case, then faith has no proper place in existence. Then faith is a temptation, and Abraham is lost, since he gave into it. This paradox does not permit of mediation, for it is founded precisely upon the fact that the individual is only the individual. As soon as this individual desires to express his absolute duty in the universal, to become conscious of this duty in that, he is in temptation, and even supposing he puts up a resistance to this, he never gets to the point of fulfilling the so-called absolute duty, and if he does not resist, then he sins, even though reality his act was that which it was his absolute duty to do. So what should Abraham do? If he would say to another person, Isaac I love more dearly than everything in the world, and hence it is so hard for me to sacrifice him, then surely the other would have shrugged his shoulders and said, why will you sacrifice him then? Or if the other had been a sly fellow, he surely would have seen through Abraham and perceived that he was making a show of feelings which were in strident contradiction to his act. In the story of Abraham we find such a paradox. His relation to Isaac, ethically expressed, is this, that the father should love the son. This ethical relation is reduced to a relative position in contrast with the absolute relation to God. To the question, why? Abraham has no answer except that it is a trial, a temptation, terms which, as was remarked above, express the unity of the 2 points of view, that it is for God's sake and for his own sake. In common usage, these 2 ways of regarding the matter are mutually exclusive. Thus, when we see a man do something which does not comport with the universal, we say that he scarcely can be doing it for God's sake, and by that we imply that he does it for his own sake. The paradox of faith has lost the intermediate term, i.e., the universal. On the one side it has the expression for the extremist egoism, on the other side the expression for the most absolute self-sacrifice. Faith is this paradox, and the individual absolutely cannot make himself intelligible to anybody. People imagine maybe that the individual can make himself intelligible to another individual in the same case. Such a notion would be unthinkable if in our time people did not in so many ways seek to creep slyly into greatness. The one knight of faith can render no aid to the other. Either the individual becomes a knight of faith by assuming the burden of the paradox, or he never becomes one. In these regions partnership is unthinkable. Every more precise explication of what is to be understood by Isaac the individual can give only to himself. And even if one were able, generally speaking, to define ever so precisely what should be intended by Isaac, which moreover would be the most ludicrous self-contradiction, i.e., that the particular individual who definitely stands outside the universal is subsumed under universal categories precisely when he has to act as the individual who stands outside the universal. The individual nevertheless will never be able to assure himself by the aid of others that this application is appropriate, but he can do so only by himself as the individual. Hence, even if a man were cowardly and paltry enough to wish to become a knight of faith on the responsibility, and at the peril of an outsider, he will never become one, for only the individual becomes a knight of faith as the particular individual, and this is the greatness of this knighthood, as I can well understand without entering the order, but this is also its terror, as I can comprehend even better. In Luke 14:26, as everybody knows, there is a striking doctrine taught about the absolute duty toward God. If any man cometh unto me and hateth not his own father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. This is a hard saying. Who can bear to hear it? For this reason it is heard very seldom. This silence, however, is only an evasion which is of no avail. Nevertheless, the student of theology learns to know that these words occur in the New Testament, and in one or another exegetical aid he finds the explanation that nisign in this passage, and a few others, is used in the sense of mysin, signifying minus diligo, post habeo, non colo, nihili facio. However, the context in which these words occur does not seem to strengthen this tasteful explanation. In the verse immediately following there is a story about a man who desired to build a tower, but first sat down to calculate whether he was capable of doing it, lest people might laugh at him afterwards. The close connection of this story with the verse here cited seems precisely to indicate that the words are to be taken in as terrible a sense as possible, to the end that everyone may examine himself as to whether he is able to erect the building. In case this pious and kindly exegete, who by abating the price thought he could smuggle Christianity into the world, were fortunate enough to convince a man that grammatically, linguistically, and cat analogy this was the meaning of that passage, it is to be hoped that the same moment he will be fortunate enough to convince the same man that Christianity is one of the most pitiable things in the world. For the doctrine, which in one of its most lyrical outbursts, where the consciousness of its eternal validity swells in it most strongly, has nothing else to say but a noisy word which means nothing but only signifies that one is to be less kindly, less attentive, more indifferent, the doctrine which at the moment when it makes as if it would give utterance to the terrible ends by driveling instead of terrifying, that doctrine is not worth taking off my hat to. The words are terrible, yet I fully believe that one can understand them without implying that he who understands them has courage to do them. One must at all events be honest enough to acknowledge what stands written, and to admit that it is great, even though one has not the courage for it. He who behaves thus will not find himself excluded from having part in that beautiful story which follows, for after all it contains consolation of a sort for the man who had not courage to begin the tower. But we must be honest, and not interpret this lack of courage as humility, since it is really pride, whereas the courage of faith is the only humble courage. One can easily perceive that if there is to be any sense in this passage, it must be understood literally. The one it is who requires absolute love. But he who in demanding a person's love thinks that this love should be proved also by becoming lukewarm to everything which hitherto was dear, that man is not only an egoist but stupid as well. And he who would demand such love signs at the same moment his own death warrant, supposing that his life was bound up with this coveted love. Thus a husband demands that his wife shall leave father and mother, but if he were to regard it as a proof of her extraordinary love for him that she for his sake became an indolent, lukewarm daughter, etc., then he is the stupidest of the stupid. If he had any notion of what love is, he would wish to discover that as daughter and sister she was perfect in love, and would see therein the proof that she loved him more than anyone else in the realm. What therefore in the case of a man one would regard as a sign of egoism and stupidity, that one is to regard by the help of an exegete as a worthy conception of the deity. But how hate them? I will not recall here the human distinction between loving and hating, not because I have much to object to in it, but because it is egoistic and is not in place here. However, if I regard the problem as a paradox, then I understand it. That is, I understand it in such a way as one can understand a paradox. The absolute duty may cause one to do what ethics would forbid, but by no means can it cause the knight of faith to cease to love. This is shown by Abraham. The instant he is ready to sacrifice Isaac, the ethical expression for what he does is this: he hates Isaac. But if he really hates Isaac, he can be sure that God does not require this, for Cain and Abraham are not identical. Isaac he must love with his whole soul. When God requires Isaac, he must love him if possible, even more dearly, and only on this condition can he sacrifice him. For in fact it is this love for Isaac which, by its paradoxical opposition to his love for God, makes his act a sacrifice. But the distress and dread in this paradox is that, humanly speaking, he is entirely unable to make himself intelligible. Only at the moment when his act is in absolute contradiction to his feeling is his act a sacrifice, but the reality of his act is the factor by which he belongs to the universal, and in that aspect he is and remains a murderer. Moreover, the passage in Luke must be understood in such a way as to make it clearly evident that the knight of faith has no higher expression of the universal by which he can save himself. Thus, for example, if we suppose that the church requires such a sacrifice of one of its members, we have in this case only a tragic hero. For the idea of the church is not qualitatively different from that of the state, insofar as the individual comes into it by a simple mediation. And insofar as the individual comes into the paradox, he does not reach the idea of the church. He does not come out of the paradox, but in it he must find either his blessedness or his perdition. Such an ecclesiastical hero expresses in his act the universal, and there will be no one in the church, not even his father and mother, etc., who fails to understand him. On the other hand, he is not a knight of faith, and he has also a different answer from that of Abraham. He does not say that it is a trial or a temptation in which he is tested. People commonly refrain from quoting such a text as this in Luke. They are afraid of giving men a free rein, are afraid that the worst will happen as soon as the individual takes it into his head to comport himself as the individual. Moreover, they think that to exist as the individual is the easiest thing of all, and that therefore people have to be compelled to become the universal. I cannot share either this fear or this opinion, and both for the same reason. He who has learned that to exist as the individual is the most terrible thing of all will not be fearful of saying that it is great. But then too he will say this in such a way that his words will scarcely be a snare for the bewildered man, but rather will help him into the universal, even though his words do to some extent make room for the great. The man who does not dare to mention such texts will not dare to mention Abraham either, and his notion that it is easy enough to exist as the individual implies a very suspicious admission with regard to himself. For he who has a real respect for himself and concern for his soul is convinced that the man who lives under his own supervision, alone in the whole world, lives more strictly and more secluded than a maiden in her lady's bower. that there may be some who need compulsion, some who, if they were free-footed, would riot in selfish pleasures like unruly beasts, is doubtless true, but a man must prove precisely that he is not of this number by the fact that he knows how to speak with dread and trembling, and out of reverence for the Great One is bound to speak, lest it be forgotten for fear of the ill effect, which surely will fail to eventuate when a man talks in such a way that one knows it for the great, knows its terror, and apart from the terror one does not know the great at all. Let us consider a little more closely the distress and dread in the paradox of faith. The tragic hero renounces himself in order to express the universal. The knight of faith renounces the universal in order to become the individual. As has been said, everything depends upon how one is placed. He who believes that it is easy enough to be the individual can always be sure that he is not a knight of faith, for vagabonds and roving geniuses are not men of faith. The knight of faith knows, on the other hand, that it is glorious to belong to the universal. He knows that it is beautiful and salutary to be the individual who translates himself into the universal, who edits as it were a pure and elegant edition of himself, as free from errors as possible, and which everyone can read. He knows that it is refreshing to become intelligible to oneself in the universal so that he understands it, and so that every individual who understands him understands through him in turn the universal, and both rejoice in the security of the universal. He knows that it is beautiful to be born as the individual who has the universal as his home, his friendly abiding place, which at once welcomes him with open arms when he would tarry in it. But he knows also that higher than this there winds a solitary path, narrow and steep. He knows that it is terrible to be born outside the universal, to walk without meeting a single traveler. He knows very well where he is and how he is related to men. Humanly speaking, he is crazy and cannot make himself intelligible to anyone. And yet it is the mildest expression to say that he is crazy. If he is not supposed to be that, then he is a hypocrite, and the higher he climbs on this path, the more dreadful a hypocrite he is. The knight of faith knows that to give up oneself for the universal inspires enthusiasm, and that it requires courage, but he also knows that security is to be found in this, precisely because it is for the universal. He knows that it is glorious to be understood by every noble mind, so glorious that the beholder is ennobled by it, and he feels as if he were bound. He could wish it were this task that had been allotted to him. Thus Abraham could surely have wished now and then that the task were to love Isaac as becomes a father, in a way intelligible to all, memorable throughout all ages. He could wish that the task were to sacrifice Isaac for the universal, that he might incite the fathers to illustrious deeds, and he is almost terrified by the thought that for him such wishes are only temptations and must be dealt with as such, for he knows that it is a solitary path he treads, and that he accomplishes nothing for the universal but only himself is tried and examined. Or what did Abraham accomplish for the universal? Let me speak humanly about it, quite humanly. He spent 70 years in getting a son of his old age. What other men get quickly enough and enjoy for a long time, he spent 70 years in accomplishing. And why? Because he was tried and put to the test. It's not that crazy. But Abraham believed, and Sarah wavered and got him to take Hagar as a concubine. But therefore he also had to drive her away. He gets Isaac, then he has to be tried again. He knew that it is glorious to express the universal, glorious to live with Isaac. But this is not the task. He knew that it is a kingly thing to sacrifice such a son for the universal. He himself would have found repose in that, and all would have reposed in the commendation of his deed, as a bowl reposes in its consonant. But that is not the task. He is tried. That Roman general who is celebrated by his name of Cunctator checked the fall by procrastination. But what a procrastinator Abraham is in comparison with him. Yet he did not save the state. This is the content of 130 years. Who can bear it? Would not his contemporary age, if we can speak of such a thing, have said of him, Abraham is eternally procrastinating. Finally he gets a son. That took long enough. Now he wants to sacrifice him. So is he not mad? And if at least he could explain why he wants to do it. But he always says that it is a trial. Nor could Abraham explain more, for his life is like a book placed under a divine attachment, and which never becomes publicized juris. This is the terrible thing. He who does not see it can always be sure that he is no knight of faith, but he who sees it will not deny that even the most tried of tragic heroes walks with a dancing step compared with the knight of faith, who comes slowly creeping forward. And if he has perceived this and assured himself that he has not courage to understand it, he will at least have a presentiment of the marvelous glory this knight attains in the fact that he becomes God's intimate acquaintance, the Lord's friend, and that he says thou to God in heaven, whereas even the tragic hero only addresses him in the third person. The tragic hero is soon ready and has soon finished the fight. He makes the infinite movement and then is secure in the universal. The knight of faith, on the other hand, is kept sleepless, for he is constantly trying. At every instant there is the possibility of being able to return repentantly to the universal, and this possibility can just as well be a temptation as the truth. He can derive evidence from no man which it is, for with that query he is outside the paradox. So the knight of faith has first and foremost the requisite passion to concentrate upon a single factor, the whole of the ethical which he transgresses, so that he can give himself the assurance that he really loves Isaac with his whole soul. I would elucidate yet once more the difference between the collisions which are encountered by the tragic hero and by the knight of faith. The tragic hero assures himself that the ethical obligation is totally present in him by the fact that he transforms it into a wish. Thus Agamemnon can say, "The proof that I do not offend against my parental duty is that my duty is my only wish." So here we have wish and duty face to face with one another. The fortunate chance in life is that the two correspond, that my wish is my duty and vice versa, and the task of most men in life is precisely to remain within their duty, and by their enthusiasm to transform it into their wish. The tragic hero gives up his wish in order to accomplish his duty. For the knight of faith, wish and duty are also identical, but he is required to give up both. Therefore, when he would resign himself to giving up his wish, he does not find repose, for that is after all his duty. If he would remain within his duty and his wish, he is not a knight of faith, for the absolute duty requires precisely that he should give them up. The tragic hero apprehended a higher expression of duty but not an absolute duty. If he cannot do that, he is in temptation. In the next place, he has enough passion to make this assurance available in the twinkling of an eye and in such a way that it is as completely valid as it was in the first instance. If he is unable to do this, he can never budge from the spot, for he constantly has to begin all over again. The tragic hero also concentrated in one factor, the ethical, which he teleologically surpassed, but in this respect he had support in the universal. The knight of faith has only himself alone, and this constitutes the dreadfulness of the situation. Most men live in such a way under an ethical obligation that they can let the sorrow be sufficient for the day, but they never reach this passionate concentration, this energetic consciousness. The universal may in a certain sense help the tragic hero to attain this, but the knight of faith is left all to himself. The hero does the deed and finds repose in the universal. The knight of faith is kept in constant tension. Agamemnon gives up Iphigenia, and thereby has found repose in the universal. Then he takes the step of sacrificing her. If Agamemnon does not make the infinite movement, if his soul at the decisive instant, instead of having passionate concentration, is absorbed by the common twaddle that he had several daughters and violate the Asuran which might occur, then he is of course not a hero but a hospital case. The hero's concentration Abraham also has, even though in his case it is far more difficult, since he has no support in the universal, but he makes one more movement by which he concentrates his soul upon the miracle. If Abraham did not do that, he is only an Agamemnon. If in any way it is possible to explain how he can be justified in sacrificing Isaac when thereby no profit accrues to the universal. Whether the individual is in temptation or is a knight of faith, only the individual can decide. Nevertheless, it is possible to construct from the paradox several criteria which he too can understand who is not within the paradox. The true knight of faith is always absolute isolation. The false knight is sectarian. This sectarianism is an attempt to leap away from the narrow path of the paradox and become a tragic hero at a cheap price. The tragic hero expresses the universal and sacrifices himself for it. The sectarian Ponchinolo, instead of that, has a private theater, i.e., several good friends and comrades who represent the universal just about as well as the beetles in the golden snuffbox represent justice. The knight of faith, on the contrary, is the paradox, is the individual, absolutely nothing but the individual, without connections or pretensions. This is the terrible thing which the sectarian mannequin cannot endure. For instead of learning from this terror that he is not capable of performing the great deed, and then plainly admitting it, the mannequin thinks that by uniting with several other mannequins he will be able to do it. But that is quite out of the question. In the world of spirit, no swindling is tolerated. A dozen sectaries join arms with one another. They know nothing whatever of the lonely temptations which await the knight of faith, and which he dares not shun precisely because it would be still more dreadful if he were to press forward presumptuously. The sectaries deafen one another by their noise and racket, hold the dread off by their shrieks, and such a howling company of sportsmen think they are storming heaven, and think they are on the same path as the knight of faith, who in the solitude of the universe never hears any human voice but walks alone with his dreadful responsibility. The knight of faith is obliged to rely upon himself alone. He feels the pain of not being able to make himself intelligible to others, but he feels no vain desire to guide others. The pain is his assurance that he is in the right way. This vain desire he does not know, he is too serious for that. The false knight of faith readily betrays himself by this proficiency in dieting which he has acquired in an instant. He does not comprehend what it is all about, that if another individual is to take the same path, he must become entirely in the same way the individual, and have no need of any man's guidance, least of all the guidance of a man who would obtrude himself. At this point men leap aside, they cannot bear the martyrdom of being uncomprehended, and instead of this they choose conveniently enough the worldly admiration of their proficiency. The true knight of faith is a witness, never a teacher, and therein lies his deep humanity, which is worth a good deal more than this silly participation in others' will, and woe which is honored by the name of sympathy, whereas in fact it is nothing but vanity. He who would only be a witness thereby avows that no man, not even the lowliest, needs another man's sympathy or should be abased that another may be exalted. But since he did not win what he won at a cheap price, neither does he sell it out at a cheap price. He is not petty enough to take men's admiration and give them in return his silent content. He knows that what is truly great is equally accessible to all. Either there is an absolute duty to our God, and if so it is the paradox here described, that the individual as the individual is higher than the universal, and as the individual stands in an absolute relation to the absolute, or else faith never existed, because it has always existed, or, to put it differently, Abraham is lost, or one must explain the passage in the 14th chapter of Luke as did that tasteful exegete, and explain in the same way the corresponding passages and similar ones.